Today I sat with Matt Mackowiak and we dove deep into the topic of homelessness. There's a kind-hearted but ultimately dangerous way to look at homelessness, and there's a cold, pragmatic, but ultimately much more ethical way to deal with this systemic issue. Having spent a lot of time thinking about homelessness, it was an important conversation that I've been wanting to have ever since I started the show. We talked about Austin's Proposition B, how homeless impacts crime, business, pollution, and property value. We discuss the issues that police face when dealing with the homeless. We talk about deinstitutionalization, the dropping prices of drugs like heroine, crack, meth, fentanyl, as well as the designer drugs like krokodil, flakka, and K2. We discuss corruption in housing first, the fallacy of the Portuguese stance on drugs, and much more. It's an important conversation I was glad to have and finally get to dig in with someone so close to the issue. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Matt Mackowiak. Hello and welcome to the RSnake Show. Today I have Matt Mackowiak. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Robert. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming down. This is going to be an interesting episode, primarily because I'm not going to talk about a lot of stuff with you that I probably should. You have this insane amount of things that I think I could just go down and probe in tons and tons of different places. So as much as people who do know you are going to go, why didn't you talk about this and that and this other thing? I'm intentionally keeping it narrow so we can have a very specific conversation, and that is about homelessness.
Sure. Yeah.
It's an area that I know I've seen you speak about, so it's not something out of the blue. I think you should have quite a bit of body of knowledge on the topic for all kinds of reasons. And it's also an area that I care a lot about. I don't know why. It's just sort of been this thing throughout my life. I've always been interested in the homeless. I think possibly because I've always been afraid of it when I was younger. And then as I got older, it was sort of like something that was always around in every major city that I lived in. So I wanted to spend a little time kind of setting the stage about, first of all, what homelessness, even the word homelessness gets a bad name. As some people like to use the word unsheltered or unhoused.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of different versions of these things. And I think for the purposes of this episode, I'm probably going to use those words a bit interchangeably, not to say anything derogatory towards homeless, because I think some people feel like that's a derogatory term. It's like as if that is somehow a bad thing to be, which, I mean, I personally think it probably is a bad thing, but but it's not because I don't have any negative feeling towards homeless in that regard. Like, well, they're lesser than. More that it is a state of being homeless.
Sure.
So just wanted to clarify that.
Descriptor.
Yeah, exactly. More of a statement of fact, less than a derogatory statement.
Yeah.
But just one fine point about that: there are people who are housed but yet homeless. They are in a shelter, for instance. So
Sure.
there is some nuance there. So if it makes sense, we can go down that path and go into the more specific detail. It's more just a area of being precise.
Sure.
So in the United States, it's been said that there is, up to about 2020 or 2019, I can't remember which. I think it was 2020. There was 580,000 homeless in the United States. So that's a pretty fair amount. But as of 2021, because the way they sort of did their analysis, I think it was Statista or whatever, went down to 326,000. So there really is no good estimation before 2020. I think 2020 is the last good marker indication of what we have. So we're just going to have to use those numbers, even if it's higher or lower, because that's the best we've got, kind of thing. Then also, the COVID relief fund ended up in a weird situation where they were housing people, but they also had to turn them away because of COVID issues.
Right.
Which
Capacity issues at shelters, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a little hard to even know, even in any individual shelter, of which many shut down, what the end effect of all
Sure.
of this stuff was. So
Yeah.
Do you have any better stats that might you come offhand that I just didn't see or anything?
No, I mean, look, first of all, it's a population that's very hard to track to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
It's transient by nature. And based on what we know, a pretty small percentage of the overall homeless population in the country remains, kind of out in the wilderness 24/7, 365 days a year. The population generally is looking for kind of their next meal, their next roof, just trying to get through their, the day to the next day.
Mm-hmm.
And so what oftentimes you see is and this is one of the problems we have in the system. It's one of the reasons why we've had chronic homelessness across the country, is that people fall through the cracks.
Sure.
And there isn't an easy way. Government doesn't make it easy to kind of track and manage not just where a person is physically, but also how you get them from step 1 to step 2 to step 3. I mean, our goal in the United States ought to be to reduce homelessness. I had the out-of-body experience of appearing on a homelessness debate on Dr. Phil a few months ago. It was actually right after the Super Bowl in Los Angeles. And it was kind of set up as a debate. It was actually a really great experience, very thoughtful and substantive conversation. They had sort of 3 advocates on the housing first side and 3 advocates on the treatment first side, which is where I am. Mm-hmm. And I started by saying, can we all agree that reducing homelessness, that moving people, into shelter, into self-sufficiency is the goal? Because if that's not the goal, then it's hard to know how do you measure success and how do you ensure you're being efficient with taxpayer dollars, et cetera. If you're trying to track whether we are succeeding to address the issue of homelessness, to mitigate the issue of homelessness, it's pretty clear across the country we're failing by any measurement. In terms of the question you asked, I don't believe it's 300,000 or 400,000. I don't believe it's 500,000 either. If you just look at the 10 or 12 largest cities in the country that have significant homeless populations, and I've studied 8 or 9 of them myself and visited all of them over the last, let's say, 3 years. If you start with Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, you put Honolulu in there, then you say Chicago, New York, D.C., and then you add Austin. Just in those cities alone, they've all seen their homeless populations increase significantly. One of the challenges you have is that, as I said before, it's a hard population to count. And so, if you don't measure something, it's hard to know whether what you're doing is working or not. Show me what you measure, and I'll show you what you care about. One of the challenges we have in this, and what I generally call the homeless industrial complex, but basically the well-intentioned, well-meaning, generous, and kind people who work in this industry, is the fewer homeless people there are, the less funding they're going to have to do the work that they're doing. And so I do think that is a fundamental issue, as we talk about this topic. But if you just look at all of those cities, LA County.
What do you think it is? What do you think the real number is? If you were
look, LA County has 100,000 by itself. 80,000 are in Los Angeles proper. So,
so maybe
it's got to be 1 million. My guess is it's in the 1 to 2 million range. Again, throwing out one number doesn't tell you very much because it ought to be about a trend. You ought to be doing one clear method of counting. Do it in the top 50 or top 20 cities in the country, on the same day of the year, and then you can begin to track it. But look, it's one of the things that frustrates me about the issue of homelessness is that that we both as a national government, but also as a state government, city government, county government, there just doesn't seem to be much incentive to deliver services more efficiently. And that's a fundamental problem.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
So I think it's worth enumerating kind of what I think happened in Austin.
Sure.
It's maybe not exactly analogous to what happened somewhere else, but it's a data point. So at one point, the Arch basically said they're going to greatly reduce or even shut down the capacity for a while. And what I noticed, I lived on the east side of Austin at the time, which is maybe 8 blocks or so away from the Arch, 10 blocks, something like that. I noticed all the homeless population just moved over to the public library, which happened to be very close to where I lived. So there was suddenly this massive homeless population where there was that population, they were just somewhere else. And then instead of the homeless population stabilizing, they then reopened the Arch and it's like it doubled. Instead of there being just that same homeless population and now they moved back to the Arch, now there was 2 homeless populations and it was double the size, approximately. These are rough, my just sort of looking around, sort of noticing what's happening. And then Hurricane Harvey hit, and it was a very strange experience. I was sitting outside and I saw this woman who was wearing effectively like all Gucci and just, looked like she just had her hair done with a shopping cart and clearly homeless, all of her stuff in there. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'm sure she's going to find her way out just fine, but in that moment at that day, she was homeless. And I noticed the homeless population surged pretty dramatically at that point. And then we had a camping ban that was just removed suddenly one day. and all of a sudden the population just exploded. It was like overnight. Is that your impression? Am I getting that timeline right? Does that sound like what you experienced? Or
yeah, and of course I wasn't back from DC when Hurricane Harvey hit. I was still in DC at that time, and so part of this is kind of what you see from a distance, and part of it's what you experienced. My involvement really began at the city level when the council decided to vote 9-2 to lift the camping ban. We had a camping ban in place in Austin for 23 years. The Austin Police Department testified to the council that they were getting 91% voluntary compliance. You don't take a policy that has 91% success and throw it out. What you do is you take your limited resources, but your significant resources, and you address the 9% of the problem that's not being addressed. That would have been a far, far, far better way to address this. Look, in the end, we know human beings respond to incentives. And no one wants to be homeless. I don't believe that. I believe there's a percentage of the overall homeless population that may want to live in a way that doesn't require them to live with rules and with responsibilities. But being homeless is not a glamorous or enjoyable experience. One of the more searing experiences that I had is I went around with a deputy constable who focuses on the homeless in April of 2021. And we went deep into the woods. We talked to lots of homeless individuals. We had a caseworker from the city with us. And I learned a lot that day. One of the things I learned is you don't, unless you do that or unless you've been homeless, you don't really understand the challenges the homeless are facing. A lot of times it's very basic things. Where do they keep their limited but their valuable possessions? How do they find a place where they can sleep in peace and quiet? A good number of them get so used to being in loud environments that it's hard when they go to a shelter and there's no noise at night. It's hard for them to fall asleep. One of the other reasons that sleeping is difficult is that depending on where they are, but in a lot of these encampments, they're constantly at risk of physical violence, sexual violence, having their possessions stolen, all kinds of horrific things. And so you're kind of always looking over your shoulder. And so in Austin, our mayor decided to push this effort to lift the camping ban along with Councilmember Greg Kassar, passed 9-2. They then went on a month-long August vacation, which they do every year. And at that time, this is totally backwards, but our mayor decided to travel to Los Angeles and San Francisco to learn about homelessness. Generally, you would go there first before you pass a significant policy change. If anything, he should have come back at the end of August and said, look, Los Angeles and San Francisco also lifted their camping ban. They were 10 or 12 years ahead of Austin. You can see what's happening in those two cities. It's going to happen here. We actually do something different. They didn't do that. Not only that, they had really no plan whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So no plan to deal with human waste and physical waste that's created by camping. No plan for the environmental effects, right? You have issues in our waterways. You have trash. You have needles. Profound effects on public safety, public health, on our intersections, on our neighborhoods, on the image of our city, on tourism. The list goes on and on and on. And so there's no question that the population grew. Could I swear under oath of a specific number? It's very hard to be precise.
So why do you think the camping ban was lifted? What is the impetus for that?
Yeah, listen, it's the question that I get more than any other question in my life. It is, why did they do this? Yeah. It so clearly failed. It was so predictable that it was going to fail. Why would they be so suicidally committed to a failed policy? I generally think that financial motivations are a pretty good guess for human understanding human behavior. When you look at the fact that we were spending roughly $70 million or so a year on homelessness, and they've basically doubled or tripled that, you look at the fact that they're proposing now, it sounds like a $300 million affordable, I'll call it an unaffordable housing bond. There's no question that they're now going to pump far more money into it. I think what they wanted is they wanted the problem to be more visible. They wanted to not have the police take so much time moving people around. And then they wanted to be able to demand and direct more resources to the issue, which is why, apart from the unaffordable housing bond, which I just mentioned, they have a massive plan to house 3,000 Austin homeless individuals over a 3-year period. I believe it's a $500 million plan. Part of that's city funded, part of it's county, part of it's federal, part of it's
half
private.
$1 billion for 3,000 people.
That's right. It's $70,000 per homeless person per year. It's $515 million is the exact amount. I think even an average business person on the back of an envelope, given 10 minutes, a cup of
seems high
of warm coffee, could come up with a more sensible, credible plan than that.
Even a very nice house in Austin for rent would be far less than that.
You would think. And there are all kinds of interesting and creative technological solutions now with pods and other things that can work as a temporary, sort of bridge solution for the population. But the reason it's hard to know exactly where the population is in our city is that the only way that we count homeless individuals is ECHO, the city's sort of preferred nonprofit on homelessness, does a point-in-time study, a point-in-time count, one night every year with volunteers. They haven't done it the last 2 years. They blamed COVID for it. I don't know why you can't put gloves on, give people face shields. You're outdoors to begin with. You don't need to go up and massage the person to count them. But either way, they haven't done that count. But if you just look at, and I talked to law enforcement sources and other people around the city that track these issues, there's a general belief that the homeless population has doubled or even tripled over the last 2 years. It was a totally unsustainable trajectory. And so the reason for that goes back to what I said at the beginning, which is incentives. And so if you tell a homeless individual, or if you just send a signal across the country that Austin is going to welcome this population, that you can do whatever you want, whenever you want, wherever you want, almost no restrictions whatsoever. They exempted very few locations for camping. In fact, when they lifted the ban initially, there were really almost no exemptions except what they call curfewed buildings, which is the new library, the governor's mansion, the Capitol, things like that. But there were really very, very basic limits on where you could camp. After a few months, we worked hard to get some modest improvements in there, and the council thankfully voted to do that. In fact, I think the original vote was 8-3, not 9-2. The later vote was 9-2, and all that did was it banned camping on sidewalks. Good, that's a public right of way. It has a very specific purpose. It banned camping in flood and fire mitigation zones, areas where fires and floods are at high likelihood. And so those were modest improvements, but again, you continue to see encampments pop up all across the city, including at places like City Hall, which is a curfew building, which was always which was prohibited. Mm-hmm. They didn't do anything about that for months and months and months, partly because City Hall was closed down for over a year due to COVID. They weren't going to do their work. So at the end of the day, Austin either intentionally or unintentionally created an incentive structure that not just caused homeless individuals to leave existing shelters to go live wherever they wanted and do whatever they wanted, but I absolutely believe it served as a magnet across the country. I know there's a program called, I think it's called Operation Homeward Bound. I might have that name wrong, but it's nonprofits in other cities that put people on buses and send them to other cities that they want to go to. And we know, if you talk about law enforcement personnel, they'll tell you these buses come in the middle of the night. They give them $50. They say good luck. And so that population has increased over the last 2 years, but it plateaued after our victory on Prop B. And
can you explain that?
Yeah,
most of the audience does not live in Austin, so
yeah, I didn't know if you want to get to that later, but so my involvement in this really kind of came out of nowhere because I really had not been up to that point had not been super engaged at the city level. I'd worked a little bit on trying to lift the ridiculous ban on Uber and Lyft. I'd worked a little bit on trying to get the MLS team here, which I thought was very positive for the city and has been very positive.
No, we got to keep this narrow.
No, I know. I'm just saying.
There's a million things I could talk to you about.
I know. I'm just saying I've done some work on some city things, but I hadn't been really engaged.
I want to talk to you about all those things, but we won't have time.
No, I understand. What I'm saying is my engagement level at the city had been limited into specific areas, sure. Really fairly shallow, and I just could not believe that this policy could be put in place and that our city leaders didn't see what it was doing. I saw it downtown. I office at 8th and Brazos. I saw it downtown immediately. There's an alley right on the side of our building. And I heard about it from people in other neighborhoods. That was the other thing. I thought initially it was a downtown problem only, and it wasn't. I mean, it was affecting every neighborhood, every intersection, every small business. Almost every woman in our city has had a negative personal experience after the camping ban was lifted. They've been harassed. A friend of theirs had been harassed. They'd seen something. You name it. So we started a nonpartisan organization called Save Austin Now, myself and a local Democrat activist named Cleo Patricic. We both believe that local issues shouldn't be partisan. I understand it's a food fight at the state level and the federal level. Shouldn't be here. We want safe roads, safe streets. We want a affordable city. We want opportunity. We want to support small businesses. Those are the things that we want in our city, and it shouldn't be too much to ask that we get those things, particularly for the amount that we spend in tax. That we have to spend in taxes. So we started Save Austin Now, and our initial goal was to try to get the council to either put the ban back in place or to do something different. Mm-hmm. And they were simply not interested.
Why is that?
Well, I'll tell you what happened.
Did they give you any indication about no, this homeless thing's working out
for
us?
They were committed. They were committed to their ideological agenda. And I think it's because, again, I think they really wanted the problem to get so bad that that they could put forward a $515 million plan and go out and direct the resources.
Did they give you any excuse? So this is working to plan. This is all phase one, and yes, we should see homeless dramatically increase for a while, but then phase two.
I'll say from the time I got involved until Prop B passed, which I'll explain in a second.
Sure.
In May of 21. We really didn't get any kind of substantive explanation or really any kind of defense of the policy. They really kind of ignored it. And so what happened is in 2020, in August of 2020 or September 2020, they did, after the governor threatened to get involved directly, and he put a very detailed memo together listing 30 or 40 different things the state was going to do if the city didn't get serious about cleaning up the mess they created. That's when they passed those modest changes. Again, you still had 2 council members who said, no, I think camping should exist in sidewalks. No, it needs to exist in fire and flood mitigation zones and these other limited areas. And so the reason that you're talking to me now, the reason that Prop B ever came to be, the reason that we've built Save Austin Now into the largest grassroots organization in the history of the city of Austin is what happened at the end of that council meeting. At the end of that council meeting, the mayor said, we are done considering changes to this policy. I don't know that I've ever heard anyone in government, at any level of government, say in public, the policy we have is perfect and it can never be improved. We don't want any more data. We don't want any more feedback. I mean, in a way, it kind of explains or kind of laid bare their kamikaze level commitment to this ideological push they were making. And so they really didn't give us any choice. We could either quit or put it on the ballot. And so we then spent roughly a year with 2 separate efforts putting a petition together. You have to have 20,000 petitions certified by the city that have been filled out correctly and signed by registered voters. We turned in about 24,000 the first time. They said we were short of 20,000. We don't believe we were. We sued the city over it. We then did a second effort.
Where is that lawsuit currently?
Well, we actually converted it. So it became moot because our second effort got on the ballot. Mm-hmm. Now, I would argue, look, it would have been on the ballot 6 months earlier. It would have cost us a lot of time, a lot of money. But in the end, mootness kind of rendered it unnecessary.
So you ended up dropping it?
Yeah, we basically dropped it.
Gotcha.
And look, we learned some lessons through that first time. The second time, we worked in about half the time and got an extra 3,000 or 4,000 signatures, and we had the highest validation rate in the history of the city. It was about 95%. We turned in 27,000 at 26,000.
It would have been interesting to get them into discovery. How did you come to this conclusion? Where did this come from?
That process itself, and I'll come back to Prop B in a second. What
Sure.
it is, so what it was, and what's happened. But yeah, that process is interesting too. What they do is they hire a statistics professor from the University of Texas. They come up with a sample, and they basically review. I'm trying to remember. It's been a little while, but I want to say it's 25% of the ballots. It might be less. It might be 10%. I can't remember offhand. But and then he has to certify to the council. I forget if it's a 90% certainty or 95% certainty that you've reached 20,000. So look, I'd been told, look, if you've done a thoughtful job of doing this, 10% more or 20% more is more than enough. We did more than 20% the first time. We went well beyond that the second time. So anyway, we get on the ballot, we get certified, and in the end, it took us an enormous amount of effort to get on the ballot, but then we had to go, win the election. So Prop B, let me explain what Prop B was. Prop B reinstated the camping ban, and it did several things. Number one, it put the ban back in place on the belief that it had been working for 23 years. Number two, it reinstated what was known as the sit-lie ordinance. The sit-lie ordinance said that in a specific area downtown, kind of the tourist district, the bar district, you can't put a sleeping bag on a park bench in front of a hotel and just sort of live there at night. It's not safe for you. It's not safe for other people. we decided to expand that area to include the UT campus and the area around UT. So we expanded it a bit. And so, Prop B was not intended to be punitive, not intended to try to put people in jail. I don't believe homeless people in jail. I don't think it's a good thing. But it was intended to force the council to stop pretending that lifting camping ban was working and to provide actual solutions. And so we spent 10 weeks. We raised I believe it was $1.9 million, never been done before in the history of the city. The only campaign that's ever raised more than that was the Uber Lyft effort to get the ban lifted, and that was funded 95% by those two companies. We had 4,000 donors from every neighborhood, every precinct, every demographic, you name it. And in the end, we won 58%, 42%, despite the mayor opposing us, 9 out of 10 council members opposing us, basically the major media in our city, for the most part, opposing us. Every Democratic Party official in a county, in a city that's basically 3-1 Democrat. So we went up against all of that, and in the end, the voters ignored the scare tactics and the fear-mongering of our leaders and said, we're tired of this. This is not working. We want the ban back in place.
I mean, just talking to the average person, just people who have nothing to do with any of this at all, I didn't know a single person who thought that was a good idea. Not one. Even people who are extremely left-leaning, they're like, this homeless thing is horrible. They got to do something. Like, this isn't working at all. So that was a strangely, extremely bipartisan, at least the people I know, extremely bipartisan. So it seems like the only people who actually did want this were very few people at the very top of the left-leaning city council. So
I agree with that in terms of pushing the policy. The thing that's a little bit concerning is you still had 42% of people who voted vote to not reinstate the ban. They basically bought the line from the other side that this was, quote unquote, criminalizing homeless existence. Being homeless has never been illegal. We didn't seek to make it illegal. Mm-hmm. What we said is you can't camp in public. Camping is a behavior. Camping takes a public space and it converts it to a private use, and there are negative second and third order consequences that come from camping. So, from our standpoint, it's absolutely true that sort of the power structure of the city, at least the elected power structure of the city, was against us. And you're right, our coalition was very bipartisan. I think we got at least 40% of the Democratic vote. I believe we got 90% of the independent vote, maybe 80% of the independent vote, and probably 95% of the Republican vote. And that's a winning coalition in Austin. I really expected after that victory that the council was going to sort of blame the voters, say, look, this isn't our policy. It's not what we want. We did what we wanted, but we respect the will of the voters, so we're going to reinstate the camping ban. That's a smart political thing to do, right? You don't take a 40% position and to double and triple down on it. And that's basically what they've done. They put together a really unserious 4-phase enforcement plan that had they enforced it, had they actually done it, might have worked, but they didn't take it seriously. It was all on paper. It did nothing. Verbal warnings, written warnings, citations, and then finally, full enforcement if someone is not paying the fines and they're still camping or still in violation. The statesman's did a good job at the time of going back and seeing how many citations were issued. It was a couple dozen. You have thousands of people in violation of the camping ban tonight as we sit here. So what have we done? What we've done since then is we sued. And this is a lawsuit that we're going to take till the ends of the earth. As long as I have two nickels to rub together, we're going to take it to the very end. And I really do want to get to discovery on that.
Sure. Because
while I am very sympathetic to the police staffing situation and the police's limited ability to even really enforce this, it's obviously a question of priorities and whether you respect the will of the voters and whether you respect an ordinance that passed overwhelmingly. And so we sued. We brought 4 small business owners in who've been directly injured, who clearly have standing. Dairy Queen owner that's had horrific things happen at his store has had to hire private security, cutting into his own business, his ability to offer bonuses, hire more people, be profitable, etc. A salon owner. We have 4 people from all different parts of the city, and so we expect to get to discovery and to get to depositions here in the next month or two, and we're going to take that all the way to the end. If we have to go to the Texas Supreme Court, we will, and I do believe we'll prevail. The other thing that happened that's important, and this is, again, another reminder of just how extreme our city leaders are here, is, 7 days or 10 days after Prop B passed in May of 2021, the Texas legislature, before The election was May 1st. I want to say they passed it maybe in the May 10th to May 20th timeframe, but right before the legislature adjourned, they passed on a bipartisan basis a statewide camping ban. Mm-hmm. And I testified in front of the House and Senate on that. We worked with the bill authors. We worked on that for months. I want to thank the bill authors on that. Tan Parker, who in the House, who's going to be a senator now, and Don Buckingham in the Senate, who's going to be likely be our land commissioner. That was a sign that even the legislature was able, on a bipartisan basis, to agree on this, that this policy doesn't work. And keep in mind, Austin was the only city in Texas that tried this. Mm-hmm. Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, very progressive cities, Democratic electorates, progressive mayors, none of them tried this. Mm-hmm. Austin's the only city in Texas that tried this. And legislators, the vast majority of them don't live in Austin, but they come here. Obviously, during session, they're here for 140 days. If they're special sessions, they're here. And then they're here maybe a day or two a month outside of that, doing hearings and other work. But they're seeing it. Mm-hmm. They're coming here and they're seeing it. And so they could kind of see for themselves the problem. We didn't get an overwhelming Democratic vote, but we got a significant number in both houses, and we're appreciative of that. But it's a reminder, not just that there was bipartisan support for reinstating the camp ban and not allowing camping anymore across our state, but it also was a message that this idea was so bad and the consequences were so devastating that this can now never be tried in another city in Texas. So Dallas, Houston, or San Antonio, or some other city, elect some extreme person who wants to go do this, runs on that agenda, can't happen. So it's just so on the lawsuit, we're moving forward on that.
What do you get out of that if you win?
Great question. So the first thing so really there's three things. One, I think there's value from discovery, from learning exactly who ordered it not to be enforced, what the basis was. My guess is there's all kinds of embarrassing, kind of traffic on emails and text messages between the mayor, perhaps the city manager, council members, perhaps senior police leaders, although I hope not. The police have their hands tied. They've effectively been told not to enforce Prop B.
Yeah, we'll get to the police and
But so what do we get? Number one, we believe we will learn a lot through discovery, and I think there'll be value to that. Number two, our belief is, and our hope and our expectation is, the courts will say you have to enforce Prop B. You can't pretend. And honestly, at this point, they can't even argue they're enforcing it. It's not even going to be credible. Third, this is a bigger question. This really isn't a question for us. It's more of a question for the four plaintiffs that joined, is whether they want to seek damages. And listen, I could spend the next month and go out and recruit 100 more plaintiffs to join. Mm-hmm. At some point, there's sort of diminishing marginal utility to doing that. But I'm telling you, the number of people who have been directly injured and have had significant damages from this policy is not an insignificant number. So, I don't know the plaintiffs have made a decision on the damages issue. I think for most people who've had negative experiences from camping, whether they're small business owners, families, whoever they are, they just want to see it stop.
There was this one time in the middle of all of that where it seemed like the camping ban was reinstated temporarily, or something was happening, or some enforcement was happening, some cleanup was happening, except under all the underpasses.
Yeah, so it gets to, there's kind
of a DPS, sort of different jurisdiction.
There's two issues related there, right? One is, state government has jurisdiction on state property, city government has jurisdiction on city property. DPS can't go into Zilker and clear out people who are illegally camping. Just like city officials, even if they were inclined to do so, can't go onto the Capitol grounds and clear people out if they were camping. So it depends on the highway you're talking about, but generally highways are either going to be federal or going to be state property. There are some county roads too, but
this was under Cesar Chavez.
Sure, look,
35.
There's a number of areas that are bad, that are underpasses, and so look, the city has cleared some of them out. The state has done some work here and there. Look, ultimately, I am really sympathetic to the state's view on this. They didn't create this mess. They don't want to necessarily sort of engage in a whack-a-mole thing where they're having to pay to have these areas cleaned out once a month. Mm-hmm. It's difficult work. I imagine, highway patrol and DPS, people who are asked to do it don't love it. You're putting your people at risk. And then you have the challenge of where you have those people go. And right now the city has done an absolutely terrible job, adding capacity to our ability to shelter our homeless population. It gets to the question of where the hell our money's gone.
So Los Angeles spent $1.2 billion in 2019 and saw an increase, not a decrease, of 43%. So what is this going to do to our budget if we actually want to take this seriously? Like, what are we just going to go down another rabbit hole just like LA did and see an increase? Like what does this? Is there ever an end to this?
Yeah. So this gets to look. LA is even worse than San Francisco, in my view. Those two cities are by far the worst in terms of how they've addressed the issue of homelessness, how their populations have grown. And I think, there's a runoff right now in the Los Angeles mayoral race. If Rick Caruso wins, I think you may see LA change direction. You've already started to see a significant directional change in San Francisco, where their DA was recalled. And I think there's going to be some other important changes in San Francisco as well. The reason that Los Angeles has failed is that they have adopted a housing first approach and have for 10 or 15 years now. And the housing first says you can't do anything with a homeless person unless you can put them in a house first. And so in my mind, would it be a nice thing and a good thing, a positive thing, if we could shelter every single homeless person in our city? The answer is yes, of course. I don't want someone on a hot pavement, 110-degree weather. The question is it effective? And, UCLA did a study that found roughly 3/4 of the homeless population has drug and alcohol addiction. 3/4 of the population has mental health challenges. And then there's overlap between those two populations, obviously. And so, think of it this way, right? If you had someone in your life that had a drug and alcohol addiction problem or a serious mental health challenge that was not being addressed, and they became homeless, and maybe they ran into you somewhere and they said, hey, listen, can you just put me in an apartment for 3 months and let me get back on my feet? You would probably think about it, but you would say, well, hang on, what are we doing about the drug and alcohol addiction issue, right? It's simply not going to work to put someone who's not dealing with the direct challenges that are affecting either their bad luck, their poor decision-making, their circumstance, unless they deal with those things directly. You're not going to be in a position where making them self-sufficient and putting them into taxpayer-funded housing is going to work. The advantage to shelters is you have people managing shelters, you have rules, you can require drugs and alcohol, you can have curfews, you can offer additional benefits as people gain and show that they're doing things the right way. The model, there's two models that I've studied closely, and they're actually both in Central Texas. It's amazing. I mean, you don't have to go to Los Angeles. You can go to Community First Village in East Austin. Alan Graham with Mobile Loaves and Fishes does a fantastic, mission-driven effort.
Explain that, because anyone listening elsewhere is not going to know what that is.
Of course, yeah, it's fascinating. Alan believes that homelessness is a lack of community first, more than anything else. And if you think about it, it actually makes sense, right? What would you do not to be homeless? You'd call every single person on your phone, right? You'd reach out to every family member. You'd reach out to people you despise, right? You'd presumably you'd go out and work, minimum wage jobs, right? Being homeless is almost as bad and a living situation as almost anything you can possibly imagine. And so if you don't have that, if you've either ruined those relationships or you're in a city where you don't know anyone or whatever, then you don't have a community to fall back on. And so what Alan's done with Community First Village is he has created a nonprofit village that does not rely on any funding from the city. And the reason for that is that he does not want the strings that the city would put on it. He has several rules. And again, this is so instructive because this shows why his model succeeds and why this Austin, Los Angeles, San Francisco model undeniably fails. Number one, you sign a contract when you get there. That contract says you have to pay rent. For some people, the rent is very small. You're talking about less than $100 a month. For some people, it could be $250 a month. Everyone lives in their own home. These are micro homes, tiny homes. I've been in them. I've toured them. I've been down there 5 or 6 times over the last year and a half. They're tripling in capacity over the next year and a half. I want to say they house, I don't remember the numbers offhand, but I want to say they house 600, 800 people now, and they're going to be at like 2,000 or 2,500 by the end of the current pathway that they're on. And part of the reason they're able to do that is they've done a great job raising private funds, but they've also got a significant investment from the county. Mm-hmm. And that was a clear message from the county. The county could have somehow partnered with the city and kept doing what they're doing, buying hotels, going with that housing first approach. In this case, what Alan believes is no drugs and alcohol. He doesn't police it, but he can tell which people are on the right pathway and which people aren't. Number two, you have to work, and you can work on property. It's almost like Deadwood. It's almost like a Western, community where they have different people doing different things. Crafts work, fixing cars, woodworking, people working, serving food, and making food. It's almost a self-sufficient community entirely by itself. Mm-hmm. But then they also have there's a bus stop there, and they can take people to different jobs. So that's a model that has been very successful. The other model that's very successful is Haven for Hope in San Antonio. And this is fascinating too. Haven for Hope. So Community First Village kind of shows how if you put rules in place, you can have success. Let me go back to that before we get to Haven for Hope. Community First Village treats the chronically homeless. They don't deal with people that fell on their hard times, just became suddenly homeless. They believe the city and other nonprofits can handle triaging those individuals, getting them back on their feet. Sure. They deal with chronically homeless. He believes their population will basically remain there the rest of their lives. He also points to the fact that homeless individuals deal with much shorter lifespans than the average population. And it's not just physical from, ailments and other things and perhaps drug and alcohol and all those kind of things. It's the psychological cost of living that way that takes a toll on you over time, and it does. So Community First Village is great for dealing with chronically homeless. If we had 10 of them in Austin or 5 of them in Austin in different parts of the city, I think we could really solve 80% of the problem. Haven for Hope in San Antonio is fascinating. It's a different model, similar in some ways, but different also. It's different because it is not intended to be the place you stay forever. Mm-hmm. It is a transitional facility. It is absolutely remarkable, and it is the product of a partnership between the city, the county, and the private sector. They had a mayor and a city manager. City manager named Cheryl Scully, who actually lives in Austin now, who I've talked to several times about Haven for Hope, who all came together. They have a camping ban in San Antonio, and they do not. They take it seriously. Mm-hmm. If you are camping in San Antonio, you get taken to Haven for Hope. And the first thing you do is you go through detox, and they don't care whether you're drunk or sober or drunk or high or not. You go through it. Once you're detoxed, you're processed. They lay out what the rules are. And I don't remember, they have an outdoor area that has misters and has lockers where you can lock some of your possessions, where you can kind of sleep in sleeping bags. I don't know what they do in the summer because it's really hot, but that's kind of an overflow space. And I want to say they house around 1,000 people there. Costs $100 million to build. Their operating budget is $20 or $25 million a year. And look, it doesn't deal with every single person who's homeless in the city of San Antonio, but you really do not see significant homeless encampments or homeless populations in that city. And it's smart for San Antonio because it's a city that is really heavily reliant on tourism. Mm-hmm. If the Riverwalk had encampments, or if the Alamo had encampments, that would really affect, their economy. So, what's the answer? The answer in Austin, in my mind, is I think we need a Haven for Hope as a bridge. And I should add that an energy executive donated the land for that facility, and then the city and the county came in, and he actually then kind of chaired the board. I'm forgetting his name at the moment, but he chaired the board for 10 years and raised a lot of the money from his peers and from people in San Antonio. And so that is such a success story. We should emulate it here.
So if I was just dropped in the middle of Austin, let's say, and I didn't know a single person, didn't have a cell phone, no way to contact anybody, and I was homeless for all intents and purposes, just the clothes on my back. Yeah. How easy is it for me, no drugs, no alcohol, just somebody who's got super bad luck and ended up being homeless? How is it without any other sort of mental illnesses or no diseases, nothing preventing me from living a healthy life other than being homeless? How easy is it for me to get out today?
Well, it's very hard. And of course it gets to the question of what do you need? And in the example that you lay out, the person needs a safe sheltered environment to get back on their feet.
Just temporarily enough to get a job.
Yeah, for a few months, get a job, save some money. Mm-hmm. one of the population, sometimes it's hard to talk about the population as if they're all the same, as if it's monolithic. And of course,
that's why I was giving you like the most perfect use case.
Yeah. So one of the problems we have is we have limited shelter. All the shelters are full. And the city does a horrendous job of what you might call case management. They don't track individuals from one thing to the next. There's no one making sure that not only are you getting your medications, but are you taking them? Are you sober? Are you working? Are you saving money? The only thing they measure under a housing first approach is heads and beds. And look, I guess that's better than not measuring anything. But that's not the sole determinant as to whether our policy is succeeding or failing.
Except they're not even measuring that because
they're not even adequately measuring that. So they use some statistics and some modeling to try to estimate what the population is, but it's laughable. And in fact, I was on a Zoom call with the guy that runs Echo, I don't know, a year ago, and I asked him, "How confident are you in your count?" And he said, "Well, we do the very best we can. It's a difficult population to count." I'm paraphrasing. I said, "Well, let me ask you this: if you had more volunteers, would you count more people?" And he said, "Yeah, I mean, there's a direct relationship." And so I said, "Well, then your count's not. It really can't be that accurate, right? What if you double the number of volunteers? Are we going to have twice as many people that we count?" So, but to answer your question, one of the things that's really frustrating, and this is one of the things I learned from working spending the day with that deputy constable and that caseworker is, sometimes what happens is a person may go into an initial sheltered environment, but there's a time limit, and if they can't get from there to the next level, their own housing, to get their own housing, they need a deposit, they need to pass a credit check, they need to be working, they probably need a car. Those four things may not sound like huge barriers and huge burdens to any person out there listening or watching this, but to a homeless person, any one of those is a significant barrier. All four of them are significant barriers. I met a woman with a deputy constable who was kind of close to what you described. She'd had some trouble. She'd been in jail. She'd had some drug addiction, but she'd really gotten past it, all of it. And she was right on the precipice of getting a place. She actually had been able to buy a car, which is amazing. But she just couldn't, in the interviews, and people talk about how people want to give people second chance hiring. Most employers don't. That's actually a huge part of the problem.
Yeah, it's a liability, so they try to avoid it.
It can be, and certainly in certain industries, banking and things like that, I can understand. But we got to
and government
certainly, right? Security clearances. We have to think about if there's ways we can do more on the second chance hiring piece. But the answer is, I'll tell you the biggest problem with the example that you laid out, and that is, you're asking a person who's already having significant challenges, who's under a lot of stress, who may not be in their right mind, to basically case manage themselves, right? And that's never.
And they may not have any idea where to even begin.
Don't know where to begin. May not have a cell phone. May not have email or access to receiving email.
I'll be honest. If I was dropped in the middle of a foreign land and didn't have a cell phone, I'd be, I got to get a cell phone somewhere because I don't know what to do.
Sure, and of course, when you see people panhandling, some they got dogs, they got some have cell phones. You kind of wonder, is this a profitable enterprise? Are they making a couple $100 a day and it's worth doing? I don't know, but our city does a terrible job of case management, of tracking people through the process. On that day that I did the ride along, I mean, we talked to a lot of people who had kind of gotten through the first step or maybe got through the second step, but then they timed out and they couldn't get to the next step. So then they come back here, right? You're spending time and money, city employee time, nonprofit time, probably nonprofit money, to try to get that person along the pathway, and then they're coming back. I mean, it's essentially a recidivism. We have a recidivism problem that is as much about our inability to manage these cases as anything else.
So I want to spend some time on the negative impacts and actually sit down and kind of enumerate them, because I think some of these may not be actually that obvious, and if there's others that I'm missing, I want to dive into them. So I'll just list them out and then we can go back.
Yeah.
Crime, traffic and loitering, housing prices, businesses, pollution, health and safety. And if you can think of others, we can do that. But so let's start with crime. The thing that I I sat down with a police officer, and when the traffic started spiking in Austin because of the homeless, and people were trying to get past, and people were stumbling in the middle of the streets, it was starting to become a problem. The local neighborhood was getting upset, and so the police said, "Why don't we have a meeting?" So they sat down with the locals, and the conversation they had with us was, I was actually very surprised. I was expecting them to go, "This is a problem. We're trying to figure out how to deal with it," anything along those lines. And it was almost exact opposite. They said, "These are your neighbors." And I'm like, wait, what? They're not my neighbors. In fact, they probably won't even be here in a couple of weeks. They'll be somewhere else. They don't have any reason to be in this location as opposed to this other location if that happens to be more beneficial for whatever reason. And then when I started really analyzing it, so, I drive past it every day and I get to spend time, within a few feet of homeless literally every day for a year or so. I noticed that it wasn't so much the homeless that was the problem with the crime. They were actually pretty okay. I mean, obviously they're self-harming and doing things they shouldn't be doing it for their own health. But it was the drug dealers right around them. They were just everywhere around them. And they were very obvious. You knew exactly who they were. And they didn't even particularly hide it. It was, even as a passerby, you would notice. And then prostitution, that started picking up. And that is going to lead to violence and all this other stuff going on, and turf wars and all kinds of the downstream effect of having so many people using drugs in such a small place is enormous. Yeah. I mean, do you have any concept of?
Absolutely. I mean, that's correct. I've gotten to know Michael Schellenberger pretty well over the last couple of years.
I was going to mention him actually.
Lives in San Francisco and has wrote a best-selling book, San Francisco, which went through in a really detailed and data-driven way why San Francisco become such a failed city.
Yeah, it's a great book. Yeah,
it is. And one of the things. He has a pretty comprehensive plan for homelessness. But one of the things he talks about is how these encampments have become open drug markets. And it's absolutely the case. And you're right. It's what you have desperate people who are being preyed upon by others, drug dealers, human traffickers, sex traffickers, violent criminals, gang members, you name it. You have horrific crimes occurring in every single encampment every single day of the week. It's a very good thing that the Rathgaber Center for Women and Families opened, the Salvation Army facility. I went down and toured that, 6 or 9 months ago. We've done a pretty good job as a city of getting women and children off the streets. Obviously, some still come in, some still, become homeless. But for the most part, they're in shelter.
They'd be just heavily predated the second they're in that environment.
Correct. So it is a heavily, male environment. But of course, people come in and come out. But you're right. I mean, look, it's a breeding ground for hard. We're not talking about people smoking marijuana. Mm-mm. We're talking about very hard drugs that are very dangerous. K2. Heroin, meth, crystal meth, fentanyl, you name it. I mean, it's a horror show. And honestly, of all the things that enrage me about the policy, how it's failed, and how our city has really not been serious about, number one, admitting they made a mistake, and number two, changing direction, is they're allowing these things to happen. Mm-hmm. There's a carelessness for human beings that is so core to allowing unregulated, unsafe, unsanitary camping that is really kind of evil on some level. It's really, really troubling. And so there's no question that the camping ordinance has contributed to increased crime in our city. We know homeless fires doubled in the first year based on stats from the Austin Fire Department to an all-time record. The city does an intentionally poor job of tracking crimes by homeless individuals, keeping that as its own data point. And of course, now with 911 calls being routed to 311, it's even harder. But I did see a study, and I'm trying to remember where it was, in Austin. It might have been Echo's point in time study. It might be somebody else, maybe the Statesman. One of the other things that you see is that you see violent crimes being perpetrated by homeless individuals against other homeless individuals.
Stealing from them.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the average person probably has some concern about walking past, an encampment or somewhere and maybe being harassed or mugged or something like that. The far more likely thing that's happening in these encampments is a homeless person is attacking another homeless person. And they're doing it for money or for their shoes.
Or drugs.
Or whatever. And so,
or often they're just very crazy people who will attack because they think they're snakes or whatever.
100%.
And it's not necessarily, it's nothing against that person. They're just crazy.
No, that's right. And so think about it. If you are putting forward a policy that basically allows camping to happen anywhere, anytime, any place, and you are not allowing the police to do anything to enforce the camping ban, then you are allowing those encampments to grow and expand and basically, let anything happen. What generally happens is these encampments grow and grow and grow and grow. People complain and complain and complain. Nothing happens for weeks or months. And then eventually they come and clear that area out. Mm-hmm. Now, the city's view is we can't clear an area out until we can put you somewhere. Mm-hmm. The problem with that is we are years away from being in a place where we're going to have enough capacity to put everyone somewhere who's illegally camping right now. The city bought 4 hotels, roughly $8 to $12 million per hotel. They're retrofitting them and they're turning them into homeless shelters. If you say we have 3,000 people and each hotel, we got more than 3,000. I think we have 10,000 would be my guess, but let's say we have 3,000. That's what roughly what the count was 2 years ago, the last time they did it. If you have 100 people per hotel, you could do the math, right? You're talking about a pretty significant number of hotels you need to go out and buy. Just at that number, you're talking about 30, right? 10 million each is $300 million. And of course, that presumes you're able to run those facilities and keep them safe and make sure there aren't just drugs and alcohol and that people are working and saving and all of those things, right? We can't even manage the limited facilities we have now with nowhere near the capacity that we need. Mm-hmm. So crime is a huge, huge issue related to this policy. It gets worse every single day. And by not allowing the police
we'll get to police
to enforce the ban,
we'll get
it makes the problem worse. Yeah.
So next one's traffic and loitering. So
yeah,
this one is pretty bad. This actually reminds me of Mexico or something. There are places in Austin where people are going to come over and try to wash your windshield, despite multiple times you telling them I don't want my windshield washed, yep. And coming over and trying to ask and loiter and to some extent that's not ultra dangerous for the most part, except that they end up in traffic. They actually are literally walking through traffic and they get accustomed to doing it. And now there's definitely places in Austin where it's not just drive slow just because there's people and pedestrians. It's drive slow because there's people wandering through the middle of the street, blocking traffic for, multiple lights and definitely backing up traffic in the process. Sometimes they're loitering and sometimes they're just high. Like the idea of pedestrians being in traffic at all is quite a dangerous topic. Just even normal pedestrians who are not on anything and very lucid, that's still a very dangerous proposition. You add in the fact that these people are either mentally insane or very high or just don't care. Mm-hmm. They're just angry at life and just don't care and they're yelling at people or whatever. That's just not a great recipe.
No, it's an issue as well. Most major intersections in Austin have someone panhandling. A lot of them have significant encampments under the underpasses. Before the camping ban was back in place, pretty much every intersection along 183, which is one of our 3 or 4 most major thoroughfares, over a 3 or 4 mile period, had a major encampment. I mean, 183 in Burnett was perhaps the worst encampment in the city, which is saying something. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, number one, you have panhandling, and depending on where you are, sometimes they go into the street. More of that happens downtown. Mm-hmm. Of course, the problem with it happening downtown is, at night you have drunk people walking around and people who are partying, and that leads to confrontations. It leads to bad decisions. It leads to combativeness.
Yeah, I could definitely see crimes against the homeless escalating
in both directions.
In both directions,
100%,
yeah, absolutely,
100%. And now the loitering issue is a huge issue too. I don't even know where to begin. I mean, Royal Blue Grocery, which is, a fairly progressive boutique grocery chain in downtown Austin, has changed their hours such that they are in almost every location not open after dark. They've had huge problems. We've seen, Starbucks announce they're going to be closing locations in a number of cities that I mentioned earlier. I don't believe Austin was one of them, although I'm kind of surprised. Depending on where you are, there's those kind of activities are occurring all the time. And when I mentioned the Dairy Queen owner, Robert Mayfield, he had I don't even want to get into it because it's gross, but he had a really unfortunate incident occur in his store where someone came in and did something pretty disgusting. And of course, these are just the cases that we hear about or that we get reported or whatever. I mean, there's probably 10 times as many that we don't know about. Sure. And so, where are city leaders when it comes to protecting women and children and families? Where are they, in protecting small businesses? A small business should be able to operate and open their doors to their customers and be safe. And I didn't mention one of the other.
You won't have civil society if you don't have commerce.
Of course not. Of course not. And I didn't mention one of the other changes to the modest changes they made is that they banned camping, basically in the immediate area at the entry of a home or business. Mm-hmm. Right? You would think, well, why wasn't that in there to begin with? Right? Any person going into their home or going into their business should be able to open their door without being obstructed. Well, particularly businesses that have an awning. I'm thinking of a place like Kruger Jewelers at 10th and Congress downtown, a couple blocks from the Capitol. They have an awning. For over a year, they had people with a sleeping bag sleeping under that awning. If I was that person, I'd prefer an awning too. I don't get rained on. It's some kind of protection. The problem is that that's where the front door to the business is. Does that business have a right to have their employees walk in and not have to be confronted by someone who may be high, may be desperate, certainly has some measure of desperation. So yeah, the loitering issue and the panhandling issue is a huge problem. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up broken windows theory. New York had a lot of these problems in the 80s and 90s. And I know Rudy Giuliani is a different figure today in public life, but at that time, he ran on cleaning up New York City. They have a mayor now that's going to claim to try to do the same thing. We'll see if he's successful. But they did actually two things that were really interesting. The first is they put forward this idea of broken windows theory, which is to say if you don't take small infractions seriously, small infractions become big infractions, and that's absolutely true.
Yeah, I believe
person that's engaging in petty theft is going to mention grand larceny. Person that's engaged in criminal mischief, or trespassing is going to engage in something more serious.
Especially if they see something that already looks like it's been broken into.
Sure.
Like, well, doesn't matter.
Sure. So they got rid of the squeegee guys in Times Square, and they got rid of the prostitution stuff, and it in New York, experienced a 10 or 15 year run where it was really the greatest city in the world. The second thing they did, and this does get into policing, but I'll just explain it briefly, and that's CompStat. They, through their police department, they started tracking all kinds of data, more than they'd ever had before, maybe by 100-fold increase. And they studied it, and they could tell which crimes occurred in which parts of the city at which times. And what they did is they surged resources to those areas, and it reduced crime significantly across the city. We could, I don't know offhand if we have a CompStat type system in Austin. I would tend to doubt it. Whatever it is, I'm sure it's inadequate for whatever we're doing now. But until Austin gets serious about these smaller infractions, we're not going to have a safe city, and that's true both with the homeless issue and more broadly.
All right, housing prices. The weird part about homelessness is it tends to congregate around certain places, like bridges or whatever. Just getting rain, the elements off of people. So it's in some ways is a shelter, and a strange version of it.
Yeah.
But it also the people who live next to those things.
Yep.
They tend to be people who don't have very much money, because people who want to live right next to an overpass or that is the house they've chosen tend to not care about the noise, or they don't have an option to care about the noise. That's their house.
Sure.
So of all the people who are most negatively affected, it seems like it affects poor people the most, which is kind of seems like almost backwards. It seems like the rich would be affected or something, like Beverly Hills or something. But it doesn't seem like that's the case. It seems like it's mostly the people who are the closest physically to them.
Yeah, you would think, well, rich people have more disposable income, probably have cash on them, might be more willing to give someone who's panhandling money, make them feel good, make them feel charitable, not going to change their life. You're right. The locations where homeless individuals generally create these encampments or are loitering or panhandling is generally going to be in these more transitional areas. It's been interesting because you're right. I mean, generally, really nice, wealthy neighborhoods are not near intersections of major highways, not near necessarily bridges. In some cases, they can be around wooded areas. I know where we are today taping this, is near a green belt. This is one of the other, astounding things about this issue. Austin has prided itself, or as long I've been here since 1984, has prided itself on being an environmentally conscious city. And it's not just about affecting the waterways and trash and needles and chemicals from mattresses and other things getting into our waterways. That's bad enough. But it's also that it's affecting all of our parks. Mm-hmm. They banned camping in parks. That was the fourth. I forgot them earlier, but the entry to a business was the third, and then the fourth was parks. That's laughable. There's camping going on in every single park in our city right now, every single day of the year, and that's not even debatable. So for a city that claims to care about parks, always wants to get more parkland, that wants green space to be part of every development deal, they're not even patrolling or taking care of what we have. In fact, they've shut down the park police. The park police office doesn't exist anymore at the police department. So
wow.
So now, I actually thought you were going to ask me a different question about housing. I thought you were going to say, is homelessness caused by the increase in the cost of housing? And there's no doubt that Austin has had...
We can certainly get to that, too. There are some stats about any old increase in housing costs can drive a certain amount of homelessness once it hits some tipping point. And I think it's like a 30%... once more than 30% of your income goes to housing, that has a tipping point effect where homelessness kicks off.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that housing prices don't affect homelessness. I'm sure it does. I think it's probably along the margins. Mm-hmm. I fundamentally believe it's about drug and alcohol addiction and mental health, untreated mental illness more than anything.
Some sort of economic stress on somebody I could
Sure.
see driving them to drugs and alcohol. And so I could
Sure.
see why that tipping effect is maybe a first order problem that leads to the second order problem.
That's right. And so, our city believes the only way they can create affordable housing is to pass bonds and go out and build things and then choose which people get to live there. In the meantime, our property taxes are through the roof, valuations are through the roof. You can't protest. They raise taxes at every opportunity. Project Connect being one example of that. The unaffordable housing bond. Every year or two, they're trying to do something new that costs more money. And so, I'm not really sympathetic to the city council if they want to make the argument that housing prices have caused our homeless crisis. If anything, they've made affordability worse in our city through their actions.
And availability of houses has gotten way down.
And that's a huge problem too. And that's a problem they've directly made worse because with development fees in Austin are roughly 80% more than they are in any other major city in Texas. And when you add to that the time it takes to build a new house, it takes 1.5 years on average to build a new house in Travis County where Austin's located. You go one county north to Williamson, one county south to Hayes, its average is 6 months. We are not building enough housing to address the demand that we have here.
On the low end. Yeah.
On the low end. And even in the medium end. I don't know what a reasonable price is for a starter home these days. What people think a reasonable price is. I remember when I got started, I think I bought a house at $350 when I got started.
I think the most recent stat I saw was median was somewhere around $600.
Yeah, it's much higher now. And I wasn't talking about median, I was talking about a starter home. But that's right. A $500,000 or $600,000 home is going to be unattainable for 95% of people as their first home.
But that was I feel like that was a starter home for single family should be around $600,000 is what their current estimates are.
Right. So
it's crazy.
So
that's insane.
Austin does a
high.
horrendous job of addressing affordability. Number one, they make it expensive to live here through taxes and property taxes and everything. Number two, they artificially constrain the supply of housing. Number three, the development office is about 1/10 the size it needs to be. You can't get permits. If you even look the wrong way at a tree, it's a felony. Let alone remove a tree, even a dead tree from your own property. The list goes on and on and on. And so you have to kind of step back and say, how can the 11th largest city in the country have elected leadership that continues to do things that are so irrational, that are clearly failing? And the only thing I can come to is there's an ideological approach that they're totally committed to for whatever their own reasons are. And so that's why we've got to have voters independently assess these things and decide, do you like the direction the city is going? I believe 60, 70, maybe even 80% of these people who live here don't believe Austin's heading in the right direction. But until people start voting differently, we're going to continue to get what we've always gotten.
So we kind of talked about businesses already. Pollution, I think, is the next one. So you mentioned some about the waterways. I remember seeing this video this guy took. It was out of the back of his house. And so there was one guy camped back there, and you know, he couldn't really do anything about it. The police wouldn't come. They wouldn't do anything about it. So he just occasionally would go back there. And then sometime later, there's like 3 tents back there. And then some point after that, there's like 50 tents back there. And so he's just back there every day, kind of, you know, doing like a one-off, just kind of panning around in his backyard over his fence line. And gradually, like, they became extremely aggressive towards him because they could tell he's videotaping them and they don't want to be videotaped. And then, you know, try to get the cops involved in that point. And, you know, his life's getting threatened pretty regularly. And then eventually he goes back there and it's completely gone. But it's not because the police came and evicted them all. It's because there's this back behind his house is a creek. And it suddenly started raining and it just wiped out this encampment. It just completely gone. Like everything flowed downriver. And so one part of this video was he was just showing what the ground looked like, and it was completely covered with feces and needles and just trash in general. I mean, absolutely covered. It was like not an inch of actual ground left. That is all in our waterways now. And those are some very serious drugs, needles, which, you know, maybe the viruses die on them after they get exposed to rainwater or something, let's hope. But still, you know, these are dangerous things that are floating downriver, and God knows what weapons and other things might be in there. And
it's a huge problem.
That seems like an enormous issue that I really don't think anyone's even talking about the environmental aspects of what this does to, because this ends up being in a lot of waterways, as you said, a lot of runoff areas where that just happens to be a good enough place to camp temporarily until the flood comes.
Yeah, that's right. And again, as I said before, I mean, Austin, you know, has for a long time put itself out there as being one of the more environmentally responsible cities in the country. I remember when I was growing up, I mean, Save Our Springs, those groups fought development, fought malls being built, you know, fought for endangered species, et cetera. I've seen the video you're talking about. I've seen lots of other videos too. You know, if you just look at Town Lake, I was living downtown for a while, and I was kind of running on Town Lake to get exercise, you know, most days. And I mean, you could go down the Congress Avenue Bridge, and see a couch, literally a couch, coming through that waterway. It's just beyond belief, you know, that there's such little regard for, you know, these resources that we have that we're all supposed to share, that we're all supposed to care about. And I don't know why the Texas Council on Environmental Quality hasn't gotten involved. I don't know why the EPA hasn't gotten involved.
It just seems like I wouldn't even want to swim in these waters.
Of course not. And look, I don't know if it's related, and I want to be clear, I don't know if it's related, but we've had some very serious problems, some algae problems where dogs are dying and who get in the water in some different parts of our city. You know, it would seem to me that would be a reasonable potential explanation. Maybe there are other explanations. I don't know. I'm not an expert in that area. But, you know, that on that basis alone, on the environmental basis alone, you could really make almost no other arguments. And if you have a progressive government, they should be able to conclude, you're right, we can't let the environment get destroyed in our city. This is not working. We have to try something else.
I mean, this is a shared resource that I don't think anyone can complain about. It's like, no, we really do not want more random things in our water supply.
That's right. And I'll tell you, the single most creative idea, and I don't remember how it came to be. It wasn't my idea, but it kind of came from talking to someone else. It might have been that deputy constable or somebody else that I've had as a creative solution. Because look, you have this population that's growing. You're not going to be able to get enough shelter space for some period of time. You need a bridge. Even if we did a Haven for Hope here, if you went out and raised $100 million to do it, you got to build it. You got to find the land. You're talking about a long period of time. What you could do is you have hundreds of acres across the city's purchased for future parkland. Mm-hmm. You could take all the homeless individuals around our city and say the only place you're allowed to camp from now on is future parkland. And in addition to that, you're going to work that land. We're going to pay you, and you're going to beautify it and make it an appropriate park space for future families to utilize. And then when that's done, you can move to another place, or maybe by then we have enough shelter space. That is such a simple, easy solution.
Yeah.
But you know, one of the things you have to ask yourself is if there's a problem in a major city or in any part of life, and if government is not addressing the problem, it's because they want the problem to be there. And you have to ask yourself why that is.
So health and safety in general, I think, COVID was an interesting one. I thought, we did all this work to shelter in place, and yet the homeless are just doing whatever homeless do, right? They're getting drugs and they're, engaging in prostitution. I think I saw some stat that syphilis actually went up during the pandemic, which just to me, why are we even bothering with this whole shelter in place thing? Because obviously there's a huge population that is engaging in whatever and taking it home to their spouses or whatever, and it just keeps going. So I think public safety in terms of viruses or just general access to things that are unsavory, that the general society in general probably does not like whatever these things are. Do you have any sense for sort of viral outbreaks or diseases or sort of how that all plays out? Because I
don't have hard data.
Syphilis is one of the ones that I know the CDC does actually track.
Yeah, so what's interesting about that is the city specifically exempted the homeless population from the COVID procedures they were requiring the rest of us to follow. Not just shelter at home, but masking, all of it, right? And if you think about it, for all the reasons we've described, in some ways, it's actually the populations that's the most at risk, the most of contracting the virus, the most likely to transmit it. Obviously, they're not in a position to...
With a lot of comorbidities.
Exactly, comorbidities. They're not in a position to isolate, to get good care. So, it's amazing. So, I mean, I talked to a number of people who worked in hospitals, and particularly during the time frame we're talking about, there were times when half of the people coming with COVID were homeless. And so, if you're talking about 10,000 people in a city of 1 million people, and even for a short period of time, half of them roughly, or even if it's a third, have COVID. I mean, you can do the math on how much more prevalent it is there. In terms of other public health challenges, I don't know. I don't have stats.
Well, actually, that's an interesting stat in and of itself, because if that's true, that means there's definitely more than 3,000 homeless in Austin. As 5,000 or so ended up in a hospital.
Well, yeah, I don't know the number that was in the hospital. I mean, it would depend on the hospital itself. But what I'm saying is,
you're just throwing out rough numbers.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay. But yeah, I mean, that was kind of one of the dirty little secrets during that whole time frame, was that the homeless were a pretty large percentage of people who are contracting it or were going into hospitals. And of course, that's uncompensated care. They don't have insurance. That affects hospitals, affects the state budget. Every one of these problems is not an isolated problem. It doesn't just exist in its own world, without any other consequences for other people or other industries or taxpayers or families or schools or whatever. All these problems we talked about, connect. They have spokes that connect to all other parts of life.
Speaking of, let's talk about police.
Yeah.
I think the police aspect, pardon me, it's probably long COVID. I think the police's impact here is probably one of the most critical. They really are our frontline workers, despite what anyone says. They're the first when someone gets an overdose. They're the first when someone gets in a fight. They're the first when some neighbor complains about whatever, right? Mm-hmm. So I was trying to enumerate, talking to a friend who's got a very good police officer friend. We just kind of enumerated all the things he'd heard him complain about at some point, which was actually kind of useful for this podcast. But so I'm just going to go through them. First of all, it's just dangerous. I mean, they're putting themselves in extreme harm depending on the situation. These people have lots of diseases. They're very violent. They're often armed and irrational. It's just a dangerous proposition. And I'd say that about anybody, whether they're homeless or not. If someone's in that state of mind, that's just going to be a dangerous proposition.
Yeah.
Next, it's often involving petty crime.
Yep.
So it could be just as simple as just sleeping on the bench, right? They're not necessarily harming anything. And the cops really don't want to hassle these people. That's not what they signed up for. They signed up to stop bad guys and not shoo someone along down the road, so that a lot of it, I think, is just purely demoralizing. Like, I know, buddy, I know that you don't have anywhere else to go. Like, where should I go? That direction. Just keep walking, because I can't see you lay down on this bench again, kind of thing. So I think that's going to hurt their morale a lot. Next is the police had approximately a third of their budget taken away. Am I getting those numbers right?
Yeah.
I don't know what time frame that was, right around the defund the police.
So the police budget is $450 million a year. And in 2020, the council voted 11-0 to cut 1/3 of the police budget, $150 million. They took $20 million away immediately. The other $130 million they allowed themselves to spend on anything they wanted. And I don't know anyone that knows what that number was. I know it's over $70 million. Whether it got all the way to 130, I don't know. They canceled 2 scheduled cadet classes. They delayed the graduation of the current cadet class at that time. And because of all of that, they've created a profound staffing crisis where we're something like 310 or 315 police officers down from where we were when that vote occurred. And so because of that, we are in a crisis situation where we don't do proactive policing anymore. Our motorcycle unit, our traffic enforcement unit is shut down. Our anti-gang unit is shut down. Our lake patrol is shut down. Park police are shut down. We doubled our all-time homicide record last year, and we're basically on track to probably beat it this year. We'll see. So you're right. Look, the police, I'm very sensitive to the position that our cities put them in, because we don't have enough police just to handle the aspects of the job that they want to handle. They want to investigate crime. They want to prevent crime. They want to put criminals behind bars. They want a safe neighborhood, safe city and safe neighborhoods and safe businesses. They want the community to have trust in the work they're doing. They want to feel good about the work they're doing. They want to feel like they're making a difference. These are people who don't make very much money, who don't know if they're coming home after a shift. The spouse doesn't know. And now, they're under so much pressure that it's almost an impossible job. Austin's made it more unattractive to be a police officer than any time in the history of our city.
And the DA won't prosecute.
The DA won't prosecute. County attorney won't prosecute most misdemeanors. DA is not prosecuting most felonies. And in addition to that, which makes it even worse, the DA is not prosecuting criminals, but he's prosecuting police officers. He's indicted 22 separate police officers based on one incident, which was after the George Floyd protests. There was one night where things got very dangerous and very violent. They overtook the 8th Street Bridge right across from the police department, 8th Street and 35. You want to talk about pedestrians and people in the middle of the road. This is not one person with a squeegee. This was hundreds of people marching down what is maybe the single most congested portion of the single most congested road in Austin.
Which is a very congested city.
Right. And look, they were given defective non-lethal rounds. I do believe the fact that they were defective requires accountability, but you don't prosecute a line officer because they were given defective non-lethal rounds and then use them for riot control. Now, I don't believe any of those 22 people are going to be convicted. I think the odds, I would put pretty good odds on that.
It's still demoralizing.
Very demoralizing. Thankfully, the police chief chose to suspend them with pay, so they are being paid. They're on leave with pay, administrative leave with pay, but they don't know what their future is. They have significant legal bills. They don't know how much that's going to be.
So, but they're also just not prosecuting any petty crimes at the same time.
They've created a number of categories where they're not prosecuting. They're not prosecuting sex work, if you can believe that. They're not prosecuting criminal mischief. They're not prosecuting petty theft. I think it's up to $100. There's 5 or 6 different things, some types of possession of controlled substances. And of course, as we said before, broken windows theory works in this way as well. Generally someone doesn't become a murderer and they have nothing in their background of ever breaking the law. Right? They probably started stealing a car or doing something lower level. They realized they liked it, or it was a way to make money, or there was no consequence to it. And then they kind of worked their way up into much more serious, more violent crimes. And that's what we're seeing in Austin. We're seeing gang activity increase. We're seeing violent crime rise. And our ability to ensure, fully staffed police department for the shifts that are scheduled and to handle major events and special events is a huge problem. I'll tell you the biggest thing that worries me about the police in Austin, and there's like 10 things that worry me, but the thing that worries me the absolute most is we can barely handle one crisis if it happens. So we had worst shooting in the history of Austin occurred about a year ago at 6th and Trinity. 12 or 13 people were shot. A 25-year-old tourist was killed. It was a gangland gun battle at 2 a.m. downtown. If you've ever been on what we call Dirty Sixth or E6 that on a weekend at 2 a.m., it is.
I wouldn't recommend it.
Wouldn't recommend it. I did it when I was in college. It was a different era, a different time. But even that incident was really inadequate in terms of what, and we had some absolutely heroic police officers that were triaging and, cauterizing wounds and saving lives. We were very fortunate we didn't have dozens of people die that day. But imagine a scenario where you have maybe an Austin FC soccer game and a UT football game the same night, or you have ACL and a UT basketball game or something. You have two major events where you have thousands of people. And let's say you have a significant criminal event occur at both locations at the same time. We don't have enough police officers to cover two crises at one time. Any police officer will tell you that. Anyone in the police leadership will tell you that. In fact, the night of the shooting that I just told you about occurred about a year ago. They pulled officers from pretty much everywhere around the city to come in, which they should have, right? I want to say there's 6 sectors in the city of Austin. 2 of them had only one responding vehicle from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., right? So if you have, a domestic violence incident and a bank robbery, in one of those sectors, you got one officer who can respond.
Yeah. Right.
And if that person's dealing with that one, it might be hours before another officer can respond. So these are the consequences of what our city's done. And now, if you had the mayor here or Greg Starr here, they'd say, "Oh, number one, we didn't defund the police, but even if you think we did, we put the money back and everything's fine." The problem is that we have not backfilled the officers we've lost. We're losing.
And there's a delay.
It takes 3 to 4 months to recruit a cadet class of 100. They start with 100, they graduate 80, may have 65 or 70 to get through all of it. 3 or 4 months to recruit, 8 or 9 months of training, 1 or 2 months of field work, right? So add that up, you're talking about 12, 15 months to go from 0 to another 65.
And they canceled a couple classes.
Correct, but here's the issue, Robert. This is really crucial. Not only are we 300 short now, this is another thing that's crazy. You can only do one cadet class at a time. They don't allow concurrent classes. Houston has concurrent classes. They have night classes. Councilmember Mackenzie Kelly's been trying to get concurrent classes, to get a modified class. You can bring officers in from other police departments. Maybe it's only 3 or 4 months total. Mm-hmm. They're not doing any of that. So it's not just that we're 300 short. It's that in a 12 to 15 month period, we may gain 65 or 70 officers. The problem is we're losing 15 officers a month. Okay, so the crisis is growing. The delta between the size of the police force, the size of the city, and the crime rate is growing over time. Mm-hmm. And our current mayor, our current city council have shown virtually no interest in addressing that issue. Hopefully the new mayor and the new council will, starting January.
So certain crimes are also being decriminalized. So if you look at California, for instance, they've effectively decriminalized anything like theft below $900 or something.
Which is an insane limit. If you want to say 10, I'm against any limit, but allowing any of it to happen. But if you want to go in and take a candy bar from a 7-Eleven, it's not the end of the world. And I can understand why you have limited prosecutorial assets, limited police assets. You can't have everybody go chase everybody steals a candy bar. But $900 is insane. I think $100 is insane for businesses that have small, narrow margins. They're dealing with volume, convenience stores. You could talk to anybody who owns or works in a convenience store. There may be no individual industry in Austin that has been more profoundly affected in a negative way by the camping ordinance than the convenience store industry. It is unspeakable what happens in those locations. They're asking
and they're already dangerous.
Already dangerous to begin with, particularly in the middle of the night, late at night, et cetera, right? For all the reasons we can imagine. You're asking, a person's getting $11 an hour who's working, 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. to become a security officer and to go chase someone or to talk someone down. I mean, it's crazy, and it's made that business very difficult. And that's a very heavily immigrant population, not just in terms of the ownership, but in terms of the workforce.
Yeah. So, let's say all those barriers have been met, and now some police officer decides this guy's got to go to jail. They're probably out the very next day.
Exactly. And this is the chilling effect that we have right now. We've never had a worse relationship between the DA and the police department in the history of the city of Austin. And so one of the consequences of this chilling effect is that police officers now don't even really want to go put themselves at risk and go investigate and collect evidence and charge, provide the information to charge criminals in specific areas because they know the DA is not going to prosecute them anyway.
Yeah.
Why would they go rush into a 7-Eleven situation if that person's going to not be prosecuted for stealing up to $100 worth of goods? That's a rational choice. Now, it's not a choice that's good for public safety, but if they're not going to be prosecuted anyway, so you have had a explosion in lower level crimes, right? So the number of them, the frequency, the areas that they go into, they're becoming more and more and more emboldened to do these things. And as we talked about before, if you're doing petty theft today, you may be doing grand larceny and stealing a car a month from now. You're gonna graduate up that ladder, and that's what makes our city measurably less safe.
And then back to the homeless specifically, when we put them in jail for, let's say, vagrancy, just for camping, now they have a record. And now it is even harder for them so this ends up being a cycle.
Gain housing, that's right.
And so from a police officer's perspective, this is all just talking about the police's incentive here. From the police's perspective, they're going to do something that's dangerous. They're going to do something that no one wants them to do at the council level.
That may have no consequences, and if it does have consequences, may make it harder to get this person back to reenter
back into society.
Yeah.
So it's every incentive is broken to actually help people, because I'm not advocating for a nanny state, but a lot of these people really do need help, and they, for some reason, and we probably will just always have to agree, it's probably most of the time going to be drugs.
Yeah.
Not all the time, but very largely drugs or alcohol. The cops, they don't want to stand in the way of getting them better, but they also know that they're not going to get better on their own. So how's a police officer, who is the very first front line, it's not a social worker, it's going to be the cops who are getting called because someone's annoyed at the homeless, for good reasons or not, it's kind of irrelevant. They are the very first one on the scene. They're going to have to do something. So we're not, it doesn't seem like we're giving them the tools or any sort of incentive at all to do the right thing for society.
No, there's kind of a
assuming we think laws matter.
Well, I mean, look, there's like a feeling of hopelessness that I'm sure is pervasive throughout the police department, because for the reasons that you identify. And look, I didn't set out 2 years ago to, create a system where homeless individuals have criminal records and make it harder for them to become self-sufficient. I want them to be self-sufficient. I want them to live lives of productivity and lives of meaning. I want them to get back on their feet. I want them to deal with whatever challenges they have in their life. I just want it to be done in an efficient way where taxpayer dollars are respected, that works for our city. And so, I think the way you solve this, and look, you can never eliminate homelessness entirely, right? You can mitigate it, you can reduce it, you can, take it on, but it's always going to exist at some level. But what I think you do, and I go back to the number I said before about 91% voluntary compliance with the camping ban, and then the numbers I told you about the UCLA study that found 3/4 had mental health challenges, 3/4 had drug and alcohol abuse challenges. Here's the good news. The good news is we know how to handle drug and alcohol addiction. I mean, we are as advanced in that area as any time in human history.
Most of the time.
For the most part. Yeah. That's right. That's right. I mean, there's always challenges. There's new drugs coming on, and there's different opinions about things to do. But for the most part, if you have someone who knows they're addicted and wants to get better, you can get them better. Mental health, same thing. Diagnose it properly, get them their prescription, and make sure they take their medicine. And then check in on them 3 months, 6 months.
And not any unapproved medicine.
100%. So my point is, what if you took, let's say the homeless population is 10,000 people in Austin, and you said, okay, three-quarters of them are in these two categories. Well, let's address those two categories the best way we can, the most efficient way we can. Really get those people off the streets, get them the help they need. Then you're only talking about 25% of the population that remains. And so the question is, are those people suddenly homeless? The kind of person you described, which I absolutely believe exists. If you've had bad decisions or bad luck, and you really get
it's that woman wearing Gucci on the street.
Yeah, I don't know.
Whatever happened, she's going to be fine. She's going to get her way out.
Yeah, that's right. And she's been self-sufficient before. She wants to do it again. She remembers what it's like. She wants to get there, right? And I think a lot of them really do want to get there. The biggest challenge in the homeless population and dealing with from a policy perspective is, what do you do with the people who are non-compliant? There is a percentage, let's call it 10% or 15%, maybe it's 20% of the homeless population that wants to live a vagrant lifestyle, that doesn't want responsibilities, that doesn't want to have to work, that wants to be able to abuse drugs and alcohol, that doesn't want to have anyone checking in on them. that's a population where, in my view,
and they will tell you that
100%. That's a population
it's
that
not like this is something you're putting in their mouth. There's actually a lot of videos of them saying those exact words.
That's right. And so for that population, that's where I think you have to have a carrot and a stick, right? That's where we have to enforce laws. If they get a ticket for illegally camping and they continue to do it, it's just like speeding tickets, right? Eventually, you have enough speeding tickets you haven't paid, you're going to jail. Are we criminalizing driving? Are we criminalizing that? No, we're not. You have to have consequences for behaviors that are not in the public interest. So I don't approach the issue of homelessness with a sense of hopelessness. I know that there are cities in our country that have had success. There's a city in Rhode Island that put into place basically a mandatory mental health treatment program for the homeless. If you're homeless and you're camping, I forget it, which I think was Cranston, Rhode Island, but whatever city it was, you're going to jail or you're going to mandatory treatment. Well, most of them are going to choose mandatory treatment because it's a hell of a lot better than jail. Some of them maybe want to go there, maybe think they get out or whatever.
Or they think there's drugs in jail.
Or maybe there's drugs in jail, and there are. We all know that. I mean, our prison system, we could do 3 hours on the prison system, the absolute failure of our prison system. We create criminals, we create drug addicts, we expand gang membership to a great extent. There is some good work that happens with prison fellowships and other things, but it's a huge embarrassment to our country the way our prison system works. But if you could address that population that's non-compliant, there's another city in Utah that's had some success as well, similar to Rhode Island. Now, mental health reform is a really complicated, challenging issue. Involuntary commitment, we got rid of that. We don't have state hospitals are limited. We don't have that's a whole nother complicated problem.
I think that's actually funny enough. That's actually my very next thing I want to talk about. So we had the idea of sanitariums in the United States. That was a thing. I mean, there was many of them. I think. There was this concept called deinstitutionalization, where basically everyone wanted to push people out of the sanitariums. Like, well, we have these new drugs now. We can get them on the street. Like, as long as they take these drugs, they're effectively sane. And we more or less got rid of sanitariums because they thought there was a lot of abuse happening in them. There was bad conditions. People were dying of starvation in the hospital, which obviously makes no sense. The one place you'd expect them to have, consistent good care. Right. So I'm not saying that sanitariums as they once were are a good idea, but there also is a lot of studies around, as you said, there needs to be a social group. And I think this is any type of health issue, irrespective of what we're talking about. It could just be old age. If you don't have a support group, you're definitely going to die more likely than not eventually, earlier than you would have.
Think about Alcoholics Anonymous.
Yeah, right? It's a friend group of some sort.
Sure. You're sharing, you're learning from others, you're holding each other accountable, you have a sponsor. I mean,
Whether you agree with the methods or not, and actually I don't actually think they've got great efficacy for other reasons. I think that's probably the case. But probably the major problem is that we're treating this like a mental health issue exclusively. And I don't think it is. I mean, some of it is. I think you're right. I think there's some of it is. But I think some of it is the drugs themselves are making people truly crazy.
No question.
If you've ever met somebody who's been very heavily addicted to something and then come off of it, two things. Number one, they've effectively not aged at all. They're the same age as when they started.
Yeah, they're not growing.
Their brain has not progressed at all. So if they started when they're a teenager, they still act like a teenager, which is a very odd, off-putting thing if you're looking at a 6-year-old man to be acting like a 15-year-old boy.
Yeah.
And the second is they are just on the edge of being fully crazy at all times. They're having to really fight not getting in fights. They're having to fight, having a normal conversation and not getting up and doing something sporadic and that isn't a mental health thing initially, but it ends up becoming one. So how do we tackle the mental health aspect of it? Is that something that we even can do in a vacuum, or is that just absolutely off the table? We have to move to a more comprehensive carrot and stick method like you were talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I'll go to Schellenberger on that for a minute. He talked about creating basically a state network of psychiatric hospitals where you basically have mandatory care. this again gets into involuntary commitment and whether family members can put people in and there's all kinds of complicating factors. Well, the core of the problem that you have right now is you have untreated mental illness in the population, right? So if you have mental illness but you haven't been diagnosed, you don't know you have it, you're not getting treatment, you are not getting a prescription and taking it, they're not seeing if the prescription is working, right? Mm-hmm. You don't just give someone a prescription and then they stay on it for the rest of their life and nothing changes, right? Taking that prescription is going to change them, right? And they may need to lessen it, or may need to do something different, or maybe the one they gave them didn't work. To me, it's a continuum of care and a case management approach that you have to take.
So there's individual family support services, group homes, community and supportive living, foster care, personal care homes, community residences, community mental health services, supported housing, and I'm sure I'm missing a whole bunch of other versions of that same thing. If you believe that there is a good model, then effectively all those others are at least not as good as that good model, if not bad. It seems to me like we just haven't found the perfect, or if we have, it hasn't reached enough of a crescendo where enough people are noticing how well this has done that all these other methods of treatment are just, look, that's something we used to do. We don't do that anymore because it doesn't work. As you said kind of early in the thing, where's the measurement? Where's the KPIs to guarantee that we're putting the dollars in the right place? Because this is a lot of this comes from the state. The state is sponsoring a huge chunk of these things.
Yeah.
Where is the accountability to say, well, these services just don't seem to work? When we put people in your thing, we see them on the other end in the police station, 6 months from there, still high. It's not working. What you're doing isn't working. You stop getting funds and we start putting funds where things are working. Why isn't this entirely data-driven?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll be really candid. I mean, I'm a little bit less of an expert, or have less studied on the mental health challenges of this. My understanding, having talked to a lot of people about this, is it's more an issue of kind of getting people into the system than it is of people being in the system and not getting adequate care and then coming out and living productive lives, particularly as it relates to homeless, because that's...
Well, one problem is, for example, is what I'm talking about. So a very common model is you come in, you get clean for 3 months, and then you're out.
Yeah.
But that is exactly when the cravings are going to be the most acute after they've come off the initial low. It seems to me like they should be kept in place until a physician says, yeah, that they seem like they're in a good spot. They're ready for release, not just, hey, here's an arbitrary timeline, you're out.
Absolutely. I mean, it should be based on progress they're making, and
some people have a lot of challenges they're going to have to overcome.
Well, sure,
because they've committed a lot of crimes, and I can't. So I've actually spent time talking with homeless people about this, and one example of this that really bothers me a lot is, their teeth will fall out, for instance, and they're suddenly now clean, right? They've gone through the process of getting themselves clean, and they're looking in the mirror and they start remembering all these crimes they've committed against their friends, truly their friends, or their family, or all this other stuff. There's a huge amount of healing that has to happen, and sort of self-discovery. And to tell me that you can get all that done in 3 months, I have to call BS. That's just no way.
Yeah, well, that's right. And look, the other thing we haven't talked about as it relates to mental health is if you are dealing with untreated mental illness, not only are you not in a position to probably make good life decisions, which you need to start making if you're going to get yourself out of the homeless situation that you're in, but you're also going to be more susceptible to drug and alcohol abuse. Mm-hmm. Right. So these issues can be connected. And so, yeah, I mean.
And another version of that connectivity, if you have been incarcerated at any point, you're now 13 times more likely to become homeless.
That's right. That's right. And of course, part of the reason for that is that, once you become incarcerated, number one, we're making hardened criminals in jail. But number two, is it can be hard to get housing, hard to get employment, hard to keep employment, hard to get the kind of employment you want or that you think you're qualified for, the kind of jobs you want to do. Maybe you're qualified to do sort of, minimum wage type work, but obviously people don't want to do that for the most part. So yeah, we need, honestly, I hope this can be more of a state driven effort, rather than a city-driven effort. In an ideal world, you'd have everyone work together. Sometimes that can be too much to ask for in today's political environment, but we need a comprehensive look and analysis at our mental health system in our state. What works, what doesn't. How are we measuring success?
Those KPIs.
KPIs entirely. And, you double down on what works. You try some things that have worked other places. You stop doing things that don't work. You stop wasting money. Just because somebody somewhere likes a program, it doesn't mean it should continue forever.
Yeah, pet programs are a danger.
Very dangerous, yeah.
And especially in this, because your people's lives are at risk.
100%.
You're going to end up killing these people if you don't take care of them.
Particularly when if you're talking about, let's try something different that's been proven somewhere else that's going to have a much more effective outcomes versus something that we know is not working. I mean, if it's one or the other, the distance between something that's ineffective and something that's effective when the stakes are so high is pretty significant.
No kidding. All right, so back to drugs for a minute. I think this is worth spending a few minutes on. So I think that a huge chunk of this has to come with a direct effect of the dropping prices of different drugs. So, for instance, heroin, it came down very significantly after Vietnam. Then came the crack epidemic, then meth. Then we had opioids in general. There was a whole class of new pills that people could take. Then fentanyl started getting cut into things, and that dropped the price significantly on all of those things. Now we have designer drugs like krokodil, which is like a synthetic opioid, desomorphine. Flakka, it's a stimulant. Alpha PVP. Bath salts is the common name for that. K2, which is a psychoactive synthetic cannabinoid. People think they're smoking something that is more or less like marijuana, except it makes you literally completely insane.
K2 is extremely dangerous.
Not just like lay on the couch and just munch and watch some
harmless
shows.
Yeah, relatively harmless.
Absolutely, one of the most dangerous drugs out there. It makes people just run in traffic and see aliens and jump through windows and all kinds of crazy stuff. So this list of things is, all of these things are incredibly cheap now. You can get high for $2 now very easily, maybe $5 max. And there's an open air drug market where somehow the drug industry in the United States is making something like $120 billion off of $2 and $5 buys. I mean, that is an enormous amount of drugs being pumped into this population. And I don't really see, it seems like people are just sort of looking the other way when it comes to the drug dealers. Like, well, they exist, they're around, but if the homeless don't get it, then they're just going to get it somewhere else. But that's not true. Ultimately, someone has to give these people drugs, and you just have to follow the homeless for just a day or two, and they're going to find the drugs, and then you arrest the next person, et cetera, and it becomes extremely easy. I don't get why we are letting that fly. Like, why does civil society allow that to occur? Like, if we're trying to get these people off drugs and off the street, it seems like the very first thing you're going to do is tackle the people who are enabling them to do the bad thing.
You'd think, drug control policy is complicated. Federal government has a role, state to a lesser extent. Of course, Austin is, I-35, which runs from Austin to Minneapolis, right through the middle of the country, is a massive magnet for criminal enterprise, human trafficking, sex trafficking, and narco trafficking. And so Austin is kind of a victim of just kind of circumstance or geographic positioning as much as anything else. There's absolutely no doubt that our city has not done anything that I'm aware of to take on this industry. It would seem to me that if they decided to make it a priority and you had a specialized proactive policing unit that was taking that on, you could literally create task forces with the feds with significant resources to make a real difference in that regard. And look, I don't necessarily think we should be focusing on putting one person in jail because they have one pill one time. It's about the pushers, right, that are committing the felonies, that are propagating this human misery in our community, and the crime as well, and that's right. That is absolutely a key point. If it was simply smoking a joint somewhere in the middle of nowhere, harming no one, falling asleep, that's one thing. if it's instead, there is crime, violent crime surrounds serious drug use.
Mm-hmm.
It is an inherently violent industry to be in. There's a lot of money. It's a serious crime to begin with, so it attracts a kind of a violent criminal to begin with, and that turf war is serious enough that violence comes with it. And so this is one of the real tragedies of this, is that there may be differing opinions from policymakers about where to draw the line on which drugs are okay, which ones aren't, how much we should focus. Everyone should agree that violent crime has to be addressed, minimized. We have to have a real plan for it, that we focus on it, that we measure it, and that we improve it over time. Dallas and Houston, although I think they spiked up this year, the last couple of years, Dallas in particular has done a really good job. They have an outstanding mayor. They have a serious police chief. They have a solid police department. They've increased the size of their police department. They didn't defund their police. They don't have a camping ordinance. They've been very serious, and they've had improvements. Those cities have gang problems that are probably bigger than Austin's. But for whatever reason, Austin hasn't taken this seriously. And so even if there's a different people can set the line in different places as it relates to which drugs should be illegal and how much of an individual drug should be illegal, we should all focus on the scourge of violent crime, and it goes hand in hand with drug use and drug pushers.
So another thing that popped up, I was talking with a friend of mine, and he was saying you should take a look at New York, specifically with regard to the housing of the poor. So this is shelters. So this is the sheltered yet homeless. There is a very large industry in housing the homeless. Very large, and this is tens of millions of dollars being made.
Oh, billions at this point.
Just like one or two of these companies alone will make tens, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars off of housing the homeless, and they make it about $3,000 or $4,000 a month at a time per bed. Mm-hmm. New York had I think it was a shelter first sort of initiative. Like, you have to have a bed. And I think they even had it set up so that like the main czar of homelessness or whatever was personally accountable if there wasn't enough beds or something. So it was like a real mandate. They were going to take it very seriously. But what ended up happening is you made a cottage industry of the extremely run-down, awful places that should have been condemned, that were condemned in some cases, and turned them into housing for the homeless, which effectively makes these incredibly dangerous places to be. Both, like, there's literally rot in there. They're really not much better than just being on the street. In fact, in some cases might be much worse. And the density of homeless is extremely high in those places because they're filled with addicts effectively. That does not seem like a recipe for improving I understand that they're not being rained on, but in every other way, their life is now in some meaningful, important way worse. They are now in even tighter conditions in some cases than they were if they just camped in a park or whatever. No,
that's exactly right. And that's one of the byproducts of the camping ordinance that the city passed, which was that for a significant number of homeless individuals in shelters, they decided that living in a park or living under a highway overpass is preferable to living in one of these shelters. And that's because the shelters are miserable. In many cases, they're miserable. Some of them are better than others, but
one crazy stat I saw: New York cleared 239 homeless camps, and exactly 5 people moved into a shelter. Like that just should tell you right there that is not whatever
they're doing is not working.
It's not at all working.
Clearly, and let me be fair to the mayor for 1 second. Here in Austin, his view at the beginning of this was he was tired of having police expend resources just effectively moving people around from one piece of concrete to another piece of concrete.
Sure.
In a sense, I understand I understand that point of view. There's not measurable value in saying you can't be here, and then they go 10 feet down the street, and then 2 days later somebody says you got to move again. But if the reputation of the shelters is so negative in the homeless community that they refuse to go there, they refuse to stay there, they'd rather risk everything out in the elements, out on the streets. obviously something's not working. Now, do we want these things to be like, Ritz-Carlton level hotels? Of course not. That would be far too expensive. But they should be places where it's safe, where they don't allow visitors unless it's family, where people are, you keep track of whether people are taking their medication, whether there's drugs and alcohol.
And they do not allow drugs and alcohol.
They shouldn't allow them, and they should keep that, that should be a very strict policy. And so, we should study why that's failing too, and what models have worked. And let's not fund the things that fail, and let's fund the things that work.
Apparently, they were buying these properties from these rental agencies. This was a big scandal at one point. So I think it was De Blasio started buying them up, and at 3 times what their value was. So now that's even a better industry. Now these properties that were worth nothing are suddenly worth a lot. And they get to charge the companies to basically run them. So the people who've been very bad at running these things up to date are now in charge of running the things for the state. So they make a bunch of money, and then they make more money.
That's right, and that's why, again, when I get asked the question, what explains why they're so committed to this failed policy, whether it's in Austin or the cities, the most obvious explanation is financial motivation.
If you're making money on the homeless, you've picked the wrong profession, I think.
Yeah, that
is not.
It's about as bad as it gets, right?
Yeah.
We don't want people to not be able to make a living in that industry, right? And look, I think very few people who work in sort of day-to-day jobs in homeless service organizations or homeless nonprofits are wealthy. Certainly, very, very, very few of them are. Maybe people that own these companies, the people that own the buildings. We've had that happen in Austin. They've been overpaying for these hotels. Wouldn't surprise me if there were kickbacks and commissions and other things, feathering people's nests. But we don't have 30 hotels that we can purchase. We certainly don't have 100, which is what we need if it's 100 per hotel and there's 10,000 people. And of course, the other part is we haven't.
And they're not going to stay there anyway.
They're not going to stay there anyway. And then the other thing we haven't even talked about, which is nobody wants a homeless shelter near where they live or where they work. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the Arch downtown, which is the single most dangerous one-block area in downtown Austin, basically 7th and
there was a great bar there too, which I will not visit. Well, $7,000. It's a wonderful bar.
I remember when I was in college. There were 2 or 3 bars right there that were that as college kids you'd go to. You would never do that now. The Arch is a real blight on our city, and it needs to move. It needs to move to the east side or somewhere else. It shouldn't be in the middle of a tourism, hotel, residential, downtown economic engine. You have day laborers that are there all the time. You talk about pedestrians. There's no part in our city that has more people walking in the middle of the street than the Arch.
Agreed.
And I don't deny that the Arch probably does some good work, and I know that people who work there care a lot about this. I don't doubt their sincerity. What you have to question is whether what they're doing is working. Mm-hmm. And how do you measure success? What's the data that we're using? And how are we learning? How are we improving? Shouldn't be too much to ask that we care about taxpayer dollars, that we operate efficiently, and that we double down on models that are successful and that we stop models that are failing.
So the one thing that comes up often is the Portugal model. I've read a lot on this in both dimensions. So the common misnomer is that they've made all drugs legal and anybody can do anything. And suddenly it's, what do you know? All of a sudden there's a lot less crime and homelessness has dropped, et cetera, et cetera. That is not what happened at all. And it's very weird to me. I don't know if these people don't understand that that's not what happened, or they're intentionally lying about what happened. I don't know. But what actually happened is they just said, we're not going to go after it as a crime by itself. However, if there's any other thing to arrest you for, we're also going to arrest you for these drugs.
Right. And
then when you're in, you're forced to go through recidivism. You're supposed to go through a detox. Thank you. And if you don't do that, you just go to jail.
Right.
And everyone wants to avoid jail. Jail's horrible.
Sure.
That's the carrot and stick. I think that's what you're referring to, where I hate the idea of being a nanny state. I think really people should, take care of themselves. But if these people can't take care of themselves and they are draining the society, like they've ended up in the hospital multiple times, and this is clearly somebody who's committed crimes, and it's time to take their agency away from them, just in the same way we would with any criminal.
Sure.
And instead of just throwing them into the prison system and calling it a day, how about you get them some help before that all happens?
Yeah, it's an interesting model. Schellenberger's written about Portugal. He's written about Netherlands. He's traveled to both places. So he's been there and he's studied it. And you're exactly right. There's been a sort of an intentional, has to be intentional kind of
I hope not, because that's just, why would you lie about such
smear
a thing?
or false narrative basically being told about what the policy actually is and how it works. I don't necessarily think we want a society where we say use drugs anywhere, anytime, any place, and as long as you don't commit another crime, no one will bother you. And that seems, first of all, what it's going to do is it's going to lead to more crimes, because people who are using hard drugs are going to be around violent people, are going to become more desperate, and are going to eventually get into other areas of committing crime. But it's possible that the system in Portugal may work because it effectively disincentivizes people from committing other crimes, right?
And all crimes, not just drug abuse crimes.
Right. And so if you think about it, right, I mean, one of the reasons that you have violent crime around, illegal drugs is that illegal drugs are illegal to begin with. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying you legalize drugs, but maybe in this case, maybe you're decriminalizing or de-emphasizing them. You're using limited police and prosecutorial resources on things that are actually going to decrease violent crime. Look, decreasing violent crime should be the number one priority of any city government. And I mean, if you haven't read Giuliani's book, Leadership, again, I know people have different opinions about what he's been doing the last few years, but his book, Leadership, is really worth checking out. He goes through exactly what happened in New York, what they did, how he partnered with the police chief. They were monomaniacal about violent crime, and really about crime at all levels, but using data, using big data. That was one of the first police departments in the country, this is in the early 90s, that was really using big data. And of course now big data is, 1 trillion times bigger than it was then, probably. So, I mean, really the tools and the technology that's out there now is far more sophisticated. Why are we not using it here?
I agree. So one of the things that on the flip side, I try to look at both sides of every issue, just to make sure I'm understanding what's happening. One of the things I thought that was kind of an interesting, true thing I could actually see, as opposed to, just completely FUD, was if you have a camping ban in place, you're effectively losing control of these people. Once upon a time, they're all congregated in a couple places because it's okay for them to camp in these couple of places. Like on Cesar Chavez, there's just this line of homeless people, like a couple of years ago, just insane. Yeah. I mean, you didn't have to go far. You know exactly where they all are. And suddenly, with a camping ban in place, they disperse. And they're, as you said, in the woods, they're all over the place. Not knowing where they are and not being able to count them and not being able to check in on them and make sure they're okay, and also monitor their drug usage and go after the drug pushers, etc. There is something to be said about losing that telemetry. I don't think that that's a big enough reason to allow it, but yeah. I did want to highlight it as one of the things. Have you heard any other reasonable complaints about this that aren't just completely FUD? Because I really did look quite a bit, and I didn't see anything that really stood out to me.
Yeah, I think that's one. I think the other is, again, I think the advocates of putting the ordinance in place and taking the camping ban away felt like homelessness was kind of a under the radar problem, that people didn't understand what it was, and that only if it became visible would the community rally and commit to solve it or commit to address it. It would be one thing if the policy led to them being more visible, but didn't have all the other negative second and third order effects we've talked about, right? If it didn't harm public safety, if it didn't harm public health, if it didn't harm tourism and our intersections and our parks and our schools and small businesses and women, and the list goes on and on. If it did none of those things, and all it was is it made the population more visible, that at least would be an argument and a baby worth having.
That's a very good point.
If you balance it, right?
Yeah, but it's a very good point that you do lose visibility, because before this, I don't think I'd heard anyone really talking about the homeless in Austin. And all of a sudden, when the camping ban was lifted, it was definitely a front and center issue on everyone's mind. And I don't mean some people. Literally every single one of my friends brought it up, like, oh, I won't walk there, or I won't walk there without a gun. These are people who normally would completely stay away from guns, and they're like, nope, I got to have one if I'm going to walk down there because it's just very unsafe, or I'll just avoid it entirely. And I know a number of women who just wouldn't walk outside at all. They went straight to their car and drove wherever, like no pedestrian activity at all for over a year.
Two examples of that in a related note is, number one, for a long time, years and years and years and years, if you were ever traveling and somebody said, where are you from? They say, Austin. Invariably, a person would say one of two things back to you. I've heard Austin's a great town. I can't wait to visit. Mm-hmm. And you start talking about what you like about it and when you might want to come. And you don't come in July and August. It's 100 degrees. Or they'll say, I've been to Austin. Austin's a great town. You would literally never hear anything other than those two things. After the camping ordinance passed, that started to change.
I agree.
And honestly, I mean, the Convention Bureau talked about the fact that they were losing business. I talked to hotel owners, hotel workers. The consequences there were profound. But the second thing is downtown. And this connects to that police issue we talked about earlier, but homelessness and the police issue both made downtown unsafe. I still believe downtown's unsafe. It depends on where you are and what time, and it's a bit of a risk. It's always a risk anytime you go out.
And any city is.
But in terms of evaluating the risk has to be 10 times or 100 times worse today than it was 3 years ago. And so you have a lot of people in our city that say, I will not go downtown. And
I know a Green Beret who I used to live downtown, and he's like, nope, never mind. I'm not going to come visit you. And once he found out where I lived, he's like, nope, we're going to have to meet up north somewhere.
Right. And look, I mean, should everyone in our city, is the sole measurement of whether our city is succeeding, whether people can go downtown? No, it's not the sole determinant, but it is the city center. It's where the state capitol is. It's where the city hall is. It's where the largest hotels are. It's where our major entertainment districts are. I know there's the Domain and a couple others, but downtown is the economic engine of our city.
Of any city.
Absolutely, but in particular, Austin.
Sure.
And part of the reason for that is that density is allowed downtown, and we have massive buildings being built, massive buildings, and major employers taking those buildings over. And whether you like that or not, you have to protect the economic engine of our city, the investment that's been made, all the employment that's occurring there, all the commerce that's employing there, the value of the tourists that come in. I got to go through Leadership Austin in 2016 to the Essential class. I don't know if you're familiar with it at all. But you go through a year-long class with a number of other kind of up-and-coming young professionals, and you do a one day a month, and they go through different policy areas, and they bring experts in, and you learn a lot about the city, how city departments work, how nonprofits work. One of the things I learned through Leadership Austin, which was fascinating, is our occupancy, or not occupancy tax, whatever the tax is related to hotels, basically the hotel tax, the hot tax, hotel occupancy tax, a significant portion of that goes to funding the arts. And that's not just true of our major institutions. It's true of just like small things and individual artists and all kinds of things, which is, one of the great things about Austin is our artist community. Absolutely. And live music and all of that. Mm-hmm. And so if you create a situation where no one wants to get married or have weddings downtown or bachelorette parties or whatever, you're affecting, it's not just affecting a big hotel or a bar or a restaurant, which is bad enough. It's affecting even those artists who are relying on that money to come
Absolutely. In. It's funny you mentioned that. I sort of catch myself saying random things sometimes and without even thinking about it. I was on a phone call with somebody and they're like, oh, Austin's so great. I heard so much about it. Like, what's it like? And this is a year or so back. And I'm like, we have COVID, riots, and homeless. And I didn't mean to say it that succinctly, but that was what was on my mind at that moment.
There's a year where that's basically what Austin was.
Right.
Yeah.
And I realize every city was more or less shut down in the United States. So that's not that unique. The riots were, bigger cities only probably, but the homeless was just so bad. Even if I could leave my house, would I really want to walk out on the public trail? Because there's homeless everywhere. Yeah. And that just seemed very, very dangerous. So, yeah, I think that perception has changed. There's this this thing I found on the internet that this is all satire, obviously, but I wanted to read it to you. So, transportation of persons and property from the right of ways to campus should be provided free of charge. So, basically, taking people from the homeless camps and putting them on campuses, like UT campus in particular. This policy might lead to some disruptions on campus, but it would be no worse than the disruptions faced by lower-income Austinites who find such camps popping up near their homes and places of work. And certainly faculty at UT are the pinnacle of social elite in Austin and among the strongest supporters of the repeal of the ban. They benefit the most and they should pay the costs. Now, obviously, that's satire, right? But how much credence do you put to there being a sort of caste system of training people to believe that things like camping ban ordinance being lifted is actually good somehow for Austin? Is this really coming from, let's say, college campuses? Is this really a couple of professors on UT campus doing this? Is this politicians doing this? Like, who? If you were to like name like 5 people or something, would they all sort of fit a similar demographic, or is this just a confluence of hundreds of small issues? Like,
no, I mean, I don't think the UT professors or UT establishment or leadership administration was really involved in this policy too much at all, or if at all. In fact, I mean, UT was one of the real victims of all this, right? In the sense that it was affecting the campus. It was affecting the off-campus housing areas. College students are actually pretty attractive victims in some of these situations. And West Campus in particular is one of the more unsafe areas in our city. It's very dense. You have people at all hours, people partying, etc. No, I think it was really more driven by, and I don't even think it was quote unquote Democrats. I think it's really, I would describe it as really the hard left. It's groups that get funding from hard left-wing sources that were committed to a housing first approach that I think had a financial incentive. I'm talking about Homes Not Handcuffs. I'm talking about the Austin Justice Coalition. Some of these kinds of the Democratic Socialists of Austin, these kind of groups. These groups are as powerful in Austin politically as any other group. And they maintain.
Are they PACs or are they just organizations?
Some of them have PACs, some of them don't. They're all politically involved. They all recruit candidates. They all endorse people. They all have volunteers, and they what they really do is they pressure the council to enact a far left agenda, an agenda that I think is bad for families, bad for small businesses, bad for public safety, bad for
somehow
taxpayers.
They get the upside.
Yeah, and I think part of it is they pay their activists to engage. And on the other side, you basically have people that work for a living or people that are raising families that simply cannot in the middle of the week show up at a council meeting at 10 a.m., sit there until they're called and testify for 3 minutes. I mean, the first time I testified in August of 2019, I testified for 3 minutes at 1:30 in the morning. I got there at 10 a.m. I mean, I have a pretty high pain threshold, so I would have been there till 1:30 today if that was what was required. But most people can't do that. Yeah. I mean, luckily I had my laptop and I had Wi-Fi, so I was working most of the day. Actually, it was a pretty productive day. I mean, it was unpleasant, but that's part of it, is that the council, I think, feels pressure only from the far left. And so if you take whatever you want to call it, the far right to the center left, what you might call the 30-yard line all the way to that's 70 yards of the football field of the electorate in our city. Mm-hmm. You don't play games, you don't do social issues, you don't do extreme stuff, but you just focus on standard of living issues, which is what Save Austin Now has been about from the beginning. Standard of living issues, families, taxpayers, public safety, affordability, transportation, these issues. You just focus on solutions, on mainstream things, what's worked in other places, not doing things that hasn't worked in other big cities. That's what it's going to take. And we're going to have that coalition rise up. And really, we have to have that coalition rise up and basically demand that council act in that fashion. Otherwise, we're going to continue to have far left-wing groups continue to drive the agenda. And I do think it's going to start to change with a new council. I think we're going to have a better mayor, and I'm hoping we're going to have some new members of the council who are more mainstream, and we're going to work on that.
So the former New Jersey governor Richard Cody went undercover. This is a theme here. And what he found is that he was trying to get housing, and it turns out it's not particularly difficult to get housing if you're willing to go through a couple steps in New Jersey. Those couple of steps are basically just register with the state and say, hey, I want this type of assistance. I'm this person and I'm registering for the assistance.
Yeah.
But he couldn't do that because he's, trying to become this undercover person. So he obviously doesn't want to say I'm the governor, or whatever.
Yeah.
So he managed to find a place that would take him with the caveat that if you come into this place, you're going to have to do all the things that all these other places require of you, but you'll have to do it tomorrow. So the big complaint he had is how hard it was to get housing, it seemed like. And yet basically what he proved is, at least in his state, it was actually quite easy as long as you're not somebody who's wanted for some crime, where letting the police know where you are would, bring them to your doorstep. So that was kind of an interesting anecdote, because it seemed like there was something to be learned there. Well, if I'm a criminal and I'm on the run and I'm, going from, city to city or state to state or whatever, I probably don't want to alert the authorities to my presence. So I'll probably avoid shelters. So there might be some of that going on. And then there was Aurora, Colorado's mayor, Mike Kaufman. So he did the same thing.
Mm-hmm. I've studied what he did. Yeah.
Yeah, and just for the audience's sake here. So he basically found that there was two massive groups of homeless, one that do want to go to the shelter and one that do not want to go to the shelter. Mm-hmm. And when he went to the shelter, he felt like, things are pretty good here. Hot meals and the beds aren't great, but they're beds, and I feel safe. Nothing was stolen from him and no altercations. Basically, everything was fine. But when he went to the other group, it was a mess. People were violent. People stole from him. There was a lot of drugs, obviously, but there was no interest at all in becoming that other population. Yeah. They had effectively decided to opt out of it. Now, maybe it's because of that issue. Maybe it's because of, they've committed enough crimes or they're on the run and they don't really want to have another run-in with the police by letting them know. Maybe. But also, maybe it's a lifestyle thing. Maybe it's just they've decided. And I think you mentioned Schellenberger a couple times. I think his videos highlight some of these people exactly, but with their own words, saying, this is my life. This is what I want. I don't want to go to a shelter. Yeah,
and that gets to what we were talking about earlier about the non-compliant, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you're doing the work that you need to do with the 70 or 80% of the population that you can address, the drug and alcohol addicted, the mental health challenged and untreated, then you can deal with that 20%, right? And so if you took that homeless budget and you took 3/4 of it and you spent it efficiently on those populations and got them the help they needed and tracked it and saw them make progress, you could use carrots with them and sticks with the other group, mm-hmm. right? Or maybe carrots and sticks with this group and say, look, from now on, you have a choice in how you're going to live your life, and we're going to help you if you play by the rules, and if you don't, you're going to have to deal with the consequences of that. And that's really the problem right now, is there's really no consequences in Austin. Mm-hmm. For all the reasons we described, the prosecutors, the understaffed police department, the fact that they're not enforcing Prop B, the fact they don't seem to care about violent crime rising. It's basically created a toxic cocktail where all these things are connected. All these issues are connected. Each issue makes other issues more complicated, more difficult, more challenging. And, at times this whole mess can seem so big that it's a little hard to imagine, basically getting ahead of it. But we have to. I absolutely believe we can.
I think one issue that maybe people don't really think about is being in the head of a homeless person who has just, taken their 500th hit of whatever their drug of choice is. First of all, that is a very immediate, very powerful. It's hitting all your dopamine receptors, your all your serotonin receptors. You are
much more satisfying than getting housing 3 months later, right?
Yeah, the idea of even 1 day away from their drug is literally, their brain is fighting every part of them to make sure that does not happen.
Yep.
And so trying to treat them like a rational human being there is really nothing rational about somebody when they're extremely addicted.
Yes.
I mean,
that's why mandatory detox has to be part of this.
I think it's got to be.
It's got to be. And I'm telling you right now, the city council in Austin opposes mandatory detox. I mean, they oppose it with everything. It's core to who they are.
I don't even see that as particularly even vaguely cruel. I mean,
or even vaguely controversial. I would argue.
It is obviously it is.
With some it may be. But look, Here's the reason.
Otherwise, we wouldn't be here.
Well, here's the reason why, in my mind, I think it's not controversial. You are asking the public to spend taxpayer dollars to help someone else. We have the right to put some requirements on that funding. Mm-hmm. To me, that's not unreasonable. And right now, we don't put a lot of requirements on it. It's heads in beds as the only metric. It's wholly insufficient as a measurement of whether we're making progress. Why are we not tracking whether children are in school, whether you're saving money, whether you're working, whether you have transportation, right? The kinds of things you would, how you would measure whether someone's life is improving, whether they're on a good pathway or not, right? It's just, there's such a stunning disregard for taxpayer dollars and for whether taxpayer dollars are being spent efficiently and effectively, and whether we're making the problem bigger or smaller. I go back to where I started with at the very beginning of this on Dr. Phil, where I asked the homeless Housing First advocates, do we want to decrease the size of the homeless population in the country? Is that the measurement of whether we're succeeding or not? Mm-hmm. And if you agree with that, then you have to conclude we're failing, because the homeless population across the country, based on what I'd seen, has shown significant growth over the last 5 to 10 years. And look, COVID's part of that. I don't think it explains all of it. I don't think it explains much of it. Again, it's a complicated problem. There's a lot of explanations, but we can do better than we are. It's going to take new leadership in our city to do that, but it's got to start with enforcing Prop B. This fantasy that letting people do whatever they want, whenever they want, wherever they want, in open drug markets, the idea that that's good for anyone is really destructive.
So, as I said, I've been thinking about this for a long time. One of the things I had thought about was there's this X Prize for sending people to space, but I think I misheard somebody explain this to me once. They explained it to me as it was an insurance play, like I'll insure against the downside of having to pay the X Prize. So they paid, $1,000 or $10,000 or whatever for $1 million policy, and then they eventually paid out $1 million, but it came from the insurance company who took the bet, right? Mm-hmm. And so I was thinking, well, I wonder what else you could do that same sort of model. It turns out I don't think that actually is how that all happened, but it was an interesting thought experiment. So it got me thinking, like, what else could we do with that same kind of X Prize? And one of the things I came up with is, what if we could create a shelter? And this shelter was, had all the amenities. It had a bedroom, it had a living room, it had a kitchen with working plumbing and a bathroom with a door. It had windows, it had central air conditioning because it gets hot in Texas. Electrical, all the things you just expect in a house, and you could enumerate what that is: good insulation, and on, right? Energy efficient, all the things, just up to code. And I said that you had to be able to make these things. Any amount that I give you, if I give you $5,000, you have to be able to make 5 homes. Because every single home is going to be $1,000, your cost, not necessarily the end cost, but what your bill of goods is, or cost of labor, everything all in. And you need to be able to rinse and repeat. So if I said I want 10,000 of these, you should be able to print exactly the amount I want on a dime. Now, obviously, you're going to want some markup for your side. Yeah. But it should cost you no more at any given time than $1,000 per build. Right. And then you could say, well, there's an X Prize for developing this thing. There's $1 million or $10 million or whatever it takes to develop this type of house. And make it go, which I still think is possibly a very good idea, but for another day. But then I talked to people about the Housing First initiatives, and while I like the idea of very inexpensive housing, I think that's good, especially for transitionary type housing. I'm also wary of promoting that idea of you just need more houses, because I don't think it's just that. I mean, that might be a component of what we're talking about. And I love the mobes and efficients, but I think that's largely the community that's making that work, not just the house itself. It's not just a box that someone sleeps in. I'm torn, because part of me really wants to go tackle that problem and go after and create tons of really cheap houses and just find donors and figure out ways to make it even more inexpensive. But also, what I don't want is people go, great, we've got enough housing, shove them in there, because I just don't think it's going to work. Yeah, by itself, it's not a sufficient solution. It's not going to solve the problem. Homelessness is complicated, and we need more shelter space, but we also need more case management. We need a better mental health system. We need, to be able to deliver drug and alcohol treatment,
more efficiently, more effectively, more directly. There's so many aspects to this. I don't think, based on what I've seen, I don't think the issue is, do models exist where you can rapidly produce sufficient housing for homeless populations? There are pods, there are tiny homes, there are different ways to do it. There are a lot of developers out there that want to help, that want to donate, raw supplies and materials and things like that, raw materials. I don't necessarily think that's it. In an ideal world, if you had, a scalable solution that was proven, I'm sure it would help. But I agree with you. I don't think that's really the issue. You've got to create an overall system that holds people accountable for their decisions, that has incentives that rewards good behavior and puts people on a pathway to self-sufficiency and success, that addresses the core problems of mental health and drug and alcohol addiction, and then has a really specific program for the non-compliant. Mm-hmm. That is the answer.
I think
that is the answer. There's different ways to do it. I'm not the world's greatest expert. I've studied this pretty closely for 3 years now, but there are a lot of people that have worked in a lot longer, with greater study than I have. But generally, I think most people who've studied this believe the solution is something close to what I've just described. The question is, do you have courageous leaders in cities who are going to be willing to tell the truth, who are going to be willing to fight the fight, to go up against the hard left, to take some of the financial incentives out of this from the housing first approach and to focus on treatment first? Mm-hmm. You said something earlier that's really important. If you sat down someone who's drug and alcohol addicted or has untreated mental illness, and you said, okay, hey, here's how it works at our facility. You got to do this. You got to sign this. Here's your rent. You got to work. Here's how you get the bus. Here's how you apply. That person's not equipped to understand everything you're saying to them, to start making good decisions, to know what the rules are. That's why mandatory detox is so important, and that's why I think it's one of the most critical elements to Haven for Hope and why it succeeds. Mandatory detox for every single person that comes through. Not everybody on the hard left agrees with that. There are some people that think, no, people should be able to continue to use drugs, and if that's the compassionate thing to do. It's simply not compassionate for people who either have made poor decisions or have had bad luck or a combination of both and are in desperate situations for whom you are asking taxpayers to basically fund their housing for some period of time.
And some of these drugs, back to the scientific aspects of this, some of these drugs, they look like one thing and they are not that thing at all. Like you think you're smoking, marijuana or whatever, and it could easily be laced with something.
Laced with fentanyl, sure.
Laced with fentanyl. And suddenly you are now extremely addicted to fentanyl. The very first time you do it, your body craves it like nothing it's ever craved before.
That's right. And more than likely, you didn't make a conscious decision to become addicted to fentanyl that day.
Right.
Right. It happened. And so that's, again, a situation where you have to have case management. You have to have people, you have to have mandatory detox. You have to be seeing how everyone's doing. And you have to also create trust, within these communities. If you start being seen as, sort of the enforcer or the man or whatever, you're not going to build those relationships. Mm-hmm. Until someone knows, people are not going to care about how much you know until they know how much you care. And you have to communicate to that audience, to that homeless population. It starts with really one thing. Do you want your life to improve? Mm-hmm. Are you satisfied with where your life is today? If you're not satisfied, do you want your life to improve? If so, I'm here to help you improve your life. I'm here to help you improve your life, but you're going to have to do some things to get there. Mm-hmm. But it can be done. Others have done it. I've helped other people do it. We're going to get you there, but here's the system. It's really that simple. And I actually think almost every person who works in the homeless nonprofits would agree with everything I just said, and they probably approach it that way. The problem is that the way that the system works now is not working. And it's at the point now where it's hard to even make an argument that what we're doing is working.
So before anyone thinks that I truly do not care about this problem, I think I want to round it out with this. So I have been some version of homeless twice in my life. One time I was in college, or just after college rather, and I got into a very large argument with my parents. It was sort of as I was leaving college. I guess I was technically still in it. And more or less broke up with my girlfriend around the same time, and I had nowhere to go. I had no money. I had no job, I sort of had a job, but certainly nothing paying enough to pay rent or whatever. And effectively, I ended up just couch surfing for a couple of weeks and eating loquats off of trees. And a buddy of mine had a bunch of MREs he gave me, and that's what I ate. So I was effectively completely homeless. I mean, I was living in the computer lab because I was supposed to be working on computer stuff. And so...
You were sleeping there?
Sometimes. Yeah, sometimes. Because a lot of students take naps in the middle of it, so it didn't stand out. And the only reason I think I got out of that is because I hated that situation. It was awful.
Yeah.
So a couple of my friends took me in, like, you're really smart and know a lot about computers. You should just join us and become a part of our company. So I got out that way. The second time was through a divorce, and that was a much briefer stint and much later in life. And obviously I had a lot more resources at that point.
Yeah.
And that was just a matter of me deciding to get out of it. That was entirely up to me. But it wasn't so much that I had no bed to call, home that night. It wasn't like that. There was no place in my universe that I could call home, which is a very weird situation to be in. And literally, it's funny. I was working on a show with Chris DeBeck, and it was a show called Gray Man. And the idea was this guy was going to be off grid and have this backpack, and he sort of lived out of it. Effectively homeless, but really this big backstory. Effectively, really cool idea, and somebody just came out with a show called Gray Man, so it's all messed up. It's all messed. Never going to happen.
Yeah.
But I had actually produced that bag. I had made the bag to kind of test it out to see if it would work for the show, and it was kind of a fun experiment. I ended up effectively living out of that bag for a couple of weeks. On friends, like charity, they effectively let me live in their house for a little while. So I never had the true homeless experience where I was, living in a tent and getting beat up or whatever. But I also see how frail modern society is. A lot of people are living just one paycheck away from total destitution, and maybe they can call up somebody, or maybe they can't. And and a lot of people are in domestic abuse situations where they're trying to get out of bad situations, and they find themselves in bad situations. So I am extremely sympathetic with the entry process into homelessness.
Understanding how it can happen.
Yeah. Extremely sympathetic. Once homeless, I really think people lose their agency. I think they lose their agency to the drugs. And once you've lost your agency to something as powerful as fentanyl or krokodil or something like that, flakka, you're not K2, you're not coming out on your own.
No.
I mean, it's extremely unlikely. In fact, when people came back from, I think it was Vietnam, there was a lot of people addicted to heroin.
Yeah.
I forget who it was, some very smart general, I think it was, basically said, none of these soldiers get to go home until they've spent a certain amount of time in quarantine, effectively forcing them to detox before they went back home.
Yeah.
And then, of course, everyone did fine. I mean, more or less. There was a few people who, went back into it, but that detox is incredibly important part of that process. And then they're with their family, and then they're back in society, and they've cleaned themselves up, and they don't have easy access to the drugs anymore because they're not sitting there on the battlefield. Like, that is, to me, is how it works. We've seen it work with soldiers coming back. I think that model, if we extrapolate and turn it into a more sort of civil society sort of version of that, I think it has a lot of promise.
Yeah. And, you made a great point about, how someone can really kind of get stuck, in a homeless situation and really not see their own way out. There's no doubt there's a hopelessness in that community that's profound, and it's deeply sad. And look, when you get hopeless, if you're in if you're in the bottom of a hole that maybe you started digging yourself, and then the hole just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and you can't even see the light at the top anymore. If you don't have kind of positive reasons to live, if you don't have hope, if you don't have goals, if you don't feel like you're making progress, it's easier to start making bad decisions, right? To deal with the pain, to try to escape, whatever. You're desperate. You can become more and more desperate. This is one of the reasons why this homeless camping ordinance is such a terrible idea, is it takes a population that is inherently desperate, and it basically makes it easier for those individuals to be in direct interaction with people who aren't homeless. So it takes desperate people and puts them around other people, call them innocent people, taxpayers, average people in a city, And so the more you have interaction between desperate people and whatever you want to call them, average people, you're going to have negative outcomes that come from that. Now, I don't believe the answer is they should be in the woods. We never want to see them. We don't want to do anything. I've never said that that's my goal. My goal here is to help these people, get them on a pathway, get them the help, that they need. But we have to do it efficiently and effectively. And we have to stop pretending housing first is working. It's failed everywhere it's ever been tried. San Francisco's moving away from it. Houston's moving away from it.
Housing First also has the exact same death rate as if they just remained homeless,
which is astounding.
If the exact same number of people are dying, statistically identical, what are we talking about here?
Why would anyone claim that that's a policy that succeeded?
That's a bad KPI right there.
Obviously. And of course, this is the kind of thing that would only work in government, right? The private sector or business could never succeed continuing to double and triple down on a failed policy that's not working. And look, government and the private sector are different things. They have different motivations, but sometimes, the talking point of making government a little bit more like the private sector, with more data, with KPIs, makes a lot of sense. So look, I'm not hopeless about homelessness in Austin. We are not heading in the right direction. We're suing on Prop B. Absolutely has to be enforced. City's got to get serious. We've got to stop on housing first. We need to overhaul our mental health system at the statewide level, and we got to start doing a better job with case management. We've got to figure out a bridge, whether it's Haven for Hope or something else, and then we got to figure out how we can get these people into safe and sheltered environments and put them back on a path to self-sufficiency. That's the answer, and I know it can happen. I know we can do it. Unfortunately, the current leadership's not going to do it, but they've only got a few more months. We've got an important election in November, and so I would ask anyone who lives in Austin. Some of your listeners and viewers will.
A few.
A good number. But really anyone in any major city, and this applies not just to that issue, but to public safety and affordability and transportation and housing and all these other issues, is if you don't think things are headed in the right direction, it might be time to start electing new people. And I couldn't care what party they're in. Better data, letting data drive decisions. And really the other part that's so crucial is we have almost no accountability for elected officials at the local level. State level, federal level, you have elections, you have primaries, you have general elections, you have a lot more media interest. At the local level, there's very little accountability, and that's been a huge part of the problem in Austin.
All right. This has been great. How do people get in touch with you? How do they follow you? What's the best way?
Yeah, so I'm a pretty easy guy to find. I'm on Twitter. My name, Matt Mackowiak, Mackowiak, Facebook as well, LinkedIn, you name it. Our organization is called Save Austin Now. So my email is matt@saveaustinnow.com. Our website, saveaustinnow.com. You can find different things we've written. We had a national review column after we passed Prop B. The Dr. Phil stuff's out there. You can find those segments as well. But really, I guess the last thing I want to say is part of how we save our cities, and this is something Schellenberger agrees with and has talked about a lot too, is you've got to have citizens rise up and create organizations and movements together. And people can do that in every major city in America. Not everyone can do it. People got families, got businesses, they got other pressures, but good people can step up. And I never thought I'd become, whatever you want to call me, a local activist the way that I have. And I've invested a lot of time in this over the last few years, just like Cleo has, just like a lot of our volunteers have. It's been a lot of sacrifice, but I know that we can create citizen movements that just demand effective governance, that we demand that cities focus on standard of living, on how policies affect families and small businesses. It's not too much to ask. In fact, we have to demand it. If the people in office won't do it, they're part of the you're either part of the problem or they're part of the solution. At this point, it's not about friendships or who I like or whether you're conservative or liberal. I could care less. You are either part of the problem or you're part of the solution in Austin, Texas. You're addressing affordability, transportation, availability of housing, public safety, homelessness. If you're not about data and solutions and effective programs, then you're part of the problem. You're increasing human misery in our city. And I got literally zero patience for anybody that's part of the problem at this point. I want to stay in Austin. I want Austin to be a great city. I think Austin can become a global city, one of the great cities in the world. It's not going to do it right anytime soon with the leaders that we have at the moment, but once we get better leadership, I think we are right on the precipice of becoming a truly global city with a major league sports team. We could host the Olympics in the next 25 or 30 years. There's any number of potential scenarios where Austin becomes a really incredible city. But we spent a lot of time not managing growth, and we've had really ineffective government for the last few years. We've made some very bad decisions. It's not too late. We're not Los Angeles. We're not San Francisco. We don't have 100,000 homeless people. But I believe if Prop B had failed, we would have been on a trajectory per capita like Los Angeles was. And so thankfully it passed. We have kind of plateaued, but we've got to get properly enforced. We've got to get better people elected so that we start taking data seriously, taking solutions seriously.
Thank you for joining me in the RSnake show. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me. It's fun. Thank you.
Yeah.